Chapter 240, Becoming Famous, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Sleepy birds return to the forest at dusk, floating clouds return to the mountain when it's clear. Congratulations to Guilin Restaurant for its grand reopening. Guilin Restaurant, Guilin Restaurant. So it's Guilin Restaurant. Many of the old gourmands standing below the stage had a sudden spark of realization. Following that, they shouted out in excitement. Others in the crowd stared strangely at the old foodies. A white-bearded old gourmand posed in deep thought as he stroked his beard. He made sure that the people around him were itching with curiosity before he started speaking. This Guilin Restaurant is one of the old well-known restaurants in the capital. It's located where the entrance of the old West Market used to be. So it was a restaurant. The crowd finally realized what was going on. After such a huge buzz, it was just a restaurant. And here they were thinking that it was some grand event. The news spread quickly, and the originally festive atmosphere brought about by the lion dancers and the lively song dampened a little. Some people reacted with disdain. I was wondering what was going on. So it's just the opening of a restaurant, and an old poor one at that. It's even located in that desolate old West Market. Does the owner of the restaurant even know how to do business? Who's going to go to a place like that? A restaurant. They actually dared to open a restaurant. There are already over 10 or more famous restaurants on Jukyu Avenue alone. They're really overestimating themselves. I think we can all just leave now. What else are you waiting for? Let's go, let's go. Not far off, the watching manager Chin smirked. By this time, a young server had come up to greet him. Master Chin. Is everything ready? The server stood to the side and revealed the things arranged behind him. The other 5 points in the city are also ready. Manager Chin's gaze landed on the 3 mid-sized jars behind the server and he nodded at the young man. Bring them up. The server immediately called up a few men behind him to help. Just as the crowd was about to disperse, Manager Chin walked up onto the stage. The moment he entered the stage, the drummers in the troupe hit their drums with 2 forceful strokes. The crowd's attention was once again drawn to the stage. Manager Chin was dressed in a sapphire blue brocade robe. His black hair was tucked away neatly into his headpiece. Dressed as he was, he didn't seem like a servant, rather, he seemed more like a scholar. Manager Chin was someone who knew how to give off a good impression. He bowed slightly in a semicircle facing the crowd, instantly drawing their favor. With a slightly raised voice, he said courteously, "It's the opening of my master's restaurant today. Firstly, thank you all for coming." After this first line, Manager Chin bowed to the crowd once again before continuing. My master would like to pass on these words. Guilin Restaurant is one of the old restaurants in this capital after all, so it wouldn't be good if it were to fail in her hands. For today's opening, my master has specially instructed me to treat everyone to a taste of Guilin Restaurant's cooking. If you think it's good, you can draw a lot to win a seat at today's free tasting feast in Guilin Restaurant. My master said this, we're going to make our Guilin Restaurant the best restaurant in this capital, or quit the business entirely. Wow, what a boast. Manager Chin's words had practically drawn all the hatred of the other restaurants. His words had offended all the famous restaurants in the capital at once. Quite a few of the people in the crowd today were the managers and servers of the big restaurants in the capital. Without waiting for those managers and servers to stand out to scold him, some of the ardent supporters of those restaurants had already stepped up. Nonsense. It's obviously Yuhong Restaurant that makes the best food in the capital. What? It's Duran Restaurant's feast that's the best. You're just a nameless little rascal, how dare you talk so wildly? The huge crowd of people had a favorable impression of this scholarly manager at first. However, after his great boast, they only thought that he couldn't tell good from bad and was too cheeky for his own good. In an instant, the sounds of chiding and cursing filled the area below the stage. TL note, sleepy birds return to the forest at dusk, floating clouds return to the mountain when it's clear. This is a pretty Chinese poem incorporating Guilin's name, which means return to the forest. Regarding the managers, servers, and other staff of the restaurant, the modern English terms don't quite match the context of the ancient Chinese restaurant staff, but I tried my best so that we don't have more pinyin terms in the text. Manager runs the restaurant on behalf of an owner, master, server, mid-level staff who can wait on tables and settle bills. Runner welcomes customers from the street, waits on tables. Why not waiter? Well, the servers here are doing all sorts of menial labor too, which is not quite related to the term waiter, which makes me think of high-class restaurants. I thought that server might be a more neutral term. Give me your thoughts on this. Customers will also call for the staff by their titles, but it would be weird to hear server, runner, so this might be replaced by waiter when it appears. W. Chapter 241. Opening. 2. The poor manager Chin was about to be universally condemned by these people. However, Manager Chin still stood up straight on the stage with his hands behind his back. He even carried a faint smile on his face, as if those scoldings couldn't even shake him one bit. He quietly waited for the crowd to release their emotions for a moment before continuing calmly. As the saying goes, if you don't have glue, don't try to fix a broken bowl. You won't know what I can do until you see for yourself. If you don't believe me, why not come up and have a taste? My master and I will be satisfied, no matter your judgment, if you try it at the very least. Oh ho, that young manager was putting out wild boasts again. Fine, I'll make sure this conceited man returns in defeat. The spectators below hadn't thought that Manager Chin would challenge them to judge like this, earning their ire and determination. They all clamored to go up for a taste, wanting to make sure that this lousy Guilin restaurant would have no choice but to admit their loss. They wanted to make this restaurant that hadn't even opened officially turn into the joke of the capital. Manager Chin shot a look at the server behind him. The server brought out 6 strong men, who then moved a pile of crude porcelain dishes to the sides of the stage. Next, the crowd watched as big fat jars as tall as their calves were moved to the center of the stage. Looking at the 3 crudely made jars, someone below started laughing. Hey, Mr. Manager, your master can't possibly be treating us to some delicacy in those jars, right? Let me guess, don't tell me that it's pickled vegetables in those jars. Oh my, so Guilin restaurant specialty is pickled vegetables. They must be as old as Guilin restaurant itself. Manager Chin wasn't bothered by the taunts from the crowd below. He simply looked at the 3 jars and waved his hand at the server. The 3 servers standing behind the jars lifted their hands and took off the leather lids from the jars all at once. The autumn wind blew past from behind the stage, causing the fragrant aroma from the jars to drift all around the area. The noses of the people closest to the stage twitched. What is that smell? Why does it smell so good? I smelled it too. Heavens, what is that? Steam was rising from the 3 crude jars, shrouding the stage in mist. Suddenly, someone pointed at the 3 ordinary-looking crude earthenware jars. The smell is coming from those jars. After that person pointed it out, quite a few people started moving closer to the stage, causing the crowd to thicken. It's really coming from those jars. What is it? When someone finally asked the question, Manager Chin's smile slowly widened. He patiently explained to the watching crowd, "This is my master's secret recipe of braised pork in pot. It's one of our Guilin restaurant's specialties. We used top-quality pork belly and cooked it in our own secret way. All of you here have good luck. This is the first time this dish is making an appearance in this world. If you want to taste it, you'll have to be quick. Meat. Heavens. So it was actually meat in those jars. It was the first time they had seen someone using jars to cook. Furthermore, this delicious aroma was so rich and appetizing. Was it really just pork in there? How could that base pork smell so heavenly? Impossible. In the current age, very few of the nobles would use pork in their cooking. Most of the meat they ate was comprised of venison or mutton. Pork was meant for the poor commoners who couldn't afford to buy mutton. TL note, here we go, the long-awaited food porn. One of my favorite foods, braised pork. Braised pork in pot with spring onions. Braised pork. Chapter 242, Becoming Famous. 3. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Of course, the standards of cooking in the Great Wu dynasty went without speaking. Since the food made in a noble house was already that poor, How could the normal commoners fare any better? Normally, pork meat had a certain odor to it. The usage of seasonings in this era wasn't very advanced either. Pork flavored with salt and cooked in water, just the thought of it wasn't very appetizing. The aroma of this carefully braised jar of pork was an immense shock to the crowd. The commoners who had been surrounding the stage and flooding them with curses suddenly had the urge to run up to grab one of the crude porcelain dishes on the stage. There was a waiter stationed behind each of the 3 large jars with a small copper ladle in their hands, shouting and telling the crowd to line up. They dipped the ladles into the jars, giving off fragrant steam, and scooped food into the dish of the first person in line. The copper ladles were just too small. A single scoop would bring up only 2 or 3 small cubes of meat. Another waiter would then sprinkle some finely diced spring onions on top of the meat that had been turned brown by the sauce. For some reason, although it was just some meat sitting in a crude grey porcelain dish, it seemed rather artistic with the green of the spring onions, further increasing their appetite. The old gourmet who had first recognized Gwaelin Restaurant's brand had finally managed to get a small dish of the braised pork in pot after an arduous wait. He held it up in his hands carefully as he walked away. The small meat cubes in the dish were still steaming hot and trembled with his every step, practically seducing him to eat it all up. The old gourmet squeezed out of the crowd with the dish cradled protectively in his embrace before stopping and taking a long sniff at the aroma of the pork in pot. He sighed as if drunk on the smell. Following that, he took out a pair of silver chopsticks wrapped up in a cloth from his sleeves. Using the chopsticks, he carefully picked up a piece and placed it in his mouth. That delicious taste enveloped his entire mouth. After chewing it precisely 2 times, that thick flavor filled his taste buds. The meat cubes were fresh and tasty, fatty but not greasy. The old gourmet was instantly captivated by the taste of this braised pork in pot. He lost all the patience to carefully judge the remaining 2 pieces and quickly stuffed the remaining pork into his mouth. He chewed on that big mouthful of food and gulped it down. When he looked down at the empty porcelain dish in his hands, the old gourmet's mind instantly turned blank. Those 3 pieces of pork in pot weren't enough by far. He hadn't even been able to savor its flavor before it was all gone. That amount was really way too little. He smacked his lips and suddenly recalled what Manager Chin had said earlier on the stage. Other than this free sample of braised pork, they could draw a lot to win a chance to eat a free feast in Gwaelin Restaurant. The old gourmet immediately plowed through the crowd to charge back towards the stage with a strength he hadn't even known he had. Even though it seemed like there was a lot of meat in the 3 jars, it wasn't enough to feed all the people in this crowd. Furthermore, even though the jars looked big on the outside, its volume was only half of what it looked like it could contain. All the meat in the jars had been given away in an instant. When his ladle touched the bottom of the jar, the waiter realized that there was only some sauce left. He looked up and spoke apologetically to the young man at the front of the line. "Young man, I'm sorry, we've finished giving out all the free samples for our opening today. If you would like to try out Gwaelin Restaurant's cooking, then come to the alley in the West Market early in the morning." The young man stared at the waiter in disbelief, his eyes wide open. He refused to believe the waiter and even snatched the jar over to look at the emptiness within for himself. It was only then he pounded his leg in frustration and blamed himself for not queuing up earlier. The other people waiting in the queue had similar reactions after hearing the waiter's announcement. However, like the old gourmet, they recalled Manager Chin's words and fought to be the first to draw a lot from Manager Chin. In an instant, it had become more lively than ever. After eating Gwaelin Restaurant's braised pork, all the voices of opposition had melted away into nothing. Even though Gwaelin Restaurant had just newly opened and was even situated in the desolate old West Market, many of them even immediately turned into Gwaelin Restaurant's loyal fans. These 3 jars of braised pork in pot were like strong drugs. If you hadn't tasted them, you would be fine. However, after tasting it once, you would only want even more. Those few pieces of meat had drawn everyone's curiosity and appetites out of hiding. Right now, even if Gwaelin Restaurant was located in the neighboring city of Zhongju instead of the out-of-the-way Old West Market, there would still be people who would travel hundreds of miles without fatigue just to have a taste of this heavenly food again. Manager Chin's smile was kind and he faced all the people who came up to draw lots with good humor. However, Duran Restaurant's Mr. Wang, who was not too far away, felt that there was clearly a wily little fox standing behind the friendly facade of this young manager. Furthermore, it wasn't just this manager Qin who was a wily little fox. That master that he had spoken of must be an even more cunning and even bigger fox. Mr. Wang's horizons had broadened from today's spectacle. He had never seen a restaurant opening like this. He believed that it wouldn't even take a month, no, maybe not even a day, before this newly opened Guilin restaurant's name would be known all over the capital. He didn't want to admit defeat. The master behind this Guilin restaurant was quite the schemer. However, he couldn't do anything but accept this hard truth. Guilin restaurant's food was just way too tasty. Mr. Wang had already experienced much of the world with his years. He also had a noble sponsor backing his restaurant. On New Year's Day and other special days, he could use that connection to have a meal or two in a noble estate. The dishes served in that noble house were already considered heavenly delicacies to most people. However, compared to this completely ordinary-looking pork in pot, those delicacies instantly became some unpalatable rough fare. Mr. Wang sighed. However, his mind wandered back to those measly pieces of braised pork he had just eaten. He really wanted to have a few more bites. He looked down at the wooden tablet in his hands, the lot that he had just drawn. There was even a sense of anticipation within him, hoping that he would be one of the lucky ones. Chapter 243, Becoming Famous, 4. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. The sound of drums rang out from the stage. Manager Qin stood in the center, carrying himself with grace as he read out the numbers of the winning lots. With every number he read out, an excited cheer would cry out from below. Obviously, the person who held the lot with that number was the one cheering. In the end, Duran Restaurant's Mr. Wang wasn't so lucky. However, he wasn't about to admit defeat. He spent 10 whole taels of silver to buy a winning lot from one of the lucky winners. He was going to Guilin Restaurant's feast today, no matter what. The waiter following behind Mr. Wang developed an eye twitch as he watched his manager give away those big silver taels. That was 10 whole taels right there. A whole year of living expenses for his family. Guilin Restaurant had been renovated according to the blueprints that Chu Lian had drawn. Later on, she had also gotten manager Qin to buy the 2 residences on either side of the restaurant. Although Guilin Restaurant's entrance was still the same size, its insides had been changed completely. The rear court had been changed into a 2-part courtyard, complete with its own decorative mountain and long corridors. Although it couldn't be compared to the noble estates of the capital, it still had a certain air of delicate elegance, like the watery regions of Jiangnan. The original 2-part main courtyard had been changed into several small little courts. Each court had its own style of furnishing. Some of them were simple and traditional looking, others were homely and elegant, and there were even some modeled after the Japanese restaurants of the modern world. Basically, each court had its own unique flair. For their customers' convenience, the inner courtyard was reserved for females, while the outer courtyard was used for males. These little courts were made for those with higher status, while the common folk who came here just to eat would be served in the main hall and on the second floor of the main building. Guilin Restaurant had 2 entrances. There was even a hidden entrance in the back after rounding the corner, made for those with special status. The waiters and maidservants serving in the 2-part courtyard at the back were all carefully picked out by manager Qin. They were on a different level from the servers who had been shouting and serving out the free samples on the stage. Seeing as it was almost noon, Chu Lian entered Guilin Restaurant from the back in trance, accompanied by her maidservants. Once she entered the courtyard, manager Qin came over to welcome her. Third young madam, Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia have already arrived. They're waiting for you in Earth Court 1. Chu Lian nodded in acknowledgement. She hadn't expected her 2 guests to have come so early. What about the male guests? When he heard Chu Lian's question, manager Qin smiled. Jingen has already arrived. He's helping to attend to the male guests right now. Old Duke Zheng has also come. Chu Lian raised an eyebrow. She had sent Zheng 2 invites. However, she hadn't expected him to give one to old Duke Zheng. When manager Qin saw that Chu Lian's expression had changed slightly, He paused before adding on, Miss Mingyang has also come over with old Duke Zheng. Chu Lian glanced at Manager Qin, but didn't reply to him outright. She only said, have someone keep an eye on the situation. Make sure that the people who won the lucky draw are treated well, too. We can't have anything going wrong today. Third young madam, please rest assured. This subordinate will send some people to keep an eye on everything. After she finished instructing Manager Qin, she led Wenqing and Wenlan with her to meet Royal Princess Duanjia and Lady Yang. At this time, 2 carriages arrived at the entrance of the alley of the Old West Market, accompanied by a few retainers following alongside them. Even from afar, there were already commoners gawking at this expensive-looking carriage. Some ignorant children were even following the carriage from behind and running along with it. After getting shouted at by 2 burly-looking retainers on horseback, the children ran off in fright. The curtains at the front of the carriage were pulled aside from the inside. Miss Yuan rolled her eyes after taking a peek. What kind of terrible place is this? Sixth sister must have gone mad, opening a restaurant in a place like this. The lady sitting opposite her, Miss Su, glared at her. If you have nothing good to say, then don't speak at all. Miss Yuan harumphed in contempt, you're just saying so for appearances. I bet you're feeling the same way in your heart, maybe even more than I am. What are you playing the good guy for? Miss Fu smiled as she watched from the side. Miss Su's face flushed red. However, she didn't have anything to say as a retort. She was indeed thinking the same thing inwardly. Opening a restaurant out here in this desolate residential area, would any customers really come all the way out here? Even she, as a young miss who didn't know much about business, understood this logic. Could Chu Lian really be that stupid? When Miss Yuan saw that Miss Su was tongue-tied and red from frustration, she felt completely refreshed. Miss Yuan was filled with disdain. It was just a small restaurant that bitch Chu Lian even sent an invite over. She hadn't wanted to come at first, but after thinking it over, she sent someone to hear more about the situation, only to find that the restaurant was actually located in such an out-of-the-way area. Of course, she suddenly found the interest to come after that. She wanted to see how Sixth Sister was going to lose face. She still carried the grudge from that incident with the hairpin. TL note, some pictures to help you imagine what the restaurant might look like. Entrance center of courtyard with open roof ancient Chinese restaurant interior grander looking inner main hall for the courtyards mentioned in this chapter. Its layout might look something like this. 1 part courtyard 2 part courtyard. Chapter 244, Becoming Famous, 5. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. It was exactly because of that grudge that Miss Yuan pestered second madam until she agreed to let her attend the restaurant's opening together with the other young ladies of their family. Madame Rong had intended to come along as well, but an unexpected incident held her back. As the lady in charge of the Ying estate, her top priority was the estate's affairs. Thus, when Madame Rong personally escorted the 3 ladies to the estate's entrance, she instructed the eldest amongst them, Miss Su, to take care of her younger sisters in her stead before sending off their carriage. The 3 sisters had arrived late. By 12 p.m., all the manservants and maidservants in charge of welcome the guests had already returned to the restaurant, and even Chu Lian thought it was unlikely House Ying would send any representatives since it was so far past the greeting time. Without any escort at all, House Ying's carriage went straight to Guilin Restaurant's main entrance. Before they got off the carriage, one of the retainers outside leaned in close to the carriage, lowered his voice, and reported, Mrs. Guilin Restaurant's entrance has been blocked. The disdain on Miss Yuan's face was wiped clean. She lifted the curtains and looked towards Guilin Restaurant's plain-looking entrance. The entrance of Guilin Restaurant was swarming with people. There was even a long queue outside, filling the already narrow alley. How could this be possible? How could a restaurant in such a desolate area have this many customers? Miss Su also found it strange. She instructed the retainer to ask around Guilin Restaurant's main entrance. In a moment's time, that retainer returned. He carried a doubtful and baffled expression as he reported, replying to Fifth Miss, all these people are here to eat at Guilin Restaurant. What? Miss Yuan couldn't hold back her shout. Her sudden fuss over something so trivial earned her a glare from Miss Su. Miss Su paused for a while before taking out 2 fine invitations from her sleeve and passing them to the retainer. Give these 2 invitations to Guilin Restaurant's manager. Tell him that we're here to meet honored Lady Jeannie. The retainer acknowledged the order and left. Not too long later, the retainer led Manager Qin and a wise-looking senior servant over to the carriage. Manager Qin personally ordered someone to bring House Ying's carriage over to the rear entrance. Once they entered the inner court meant for female guests, senior servant Zhong took over and led them to a small court within. Senior servant Zhong instructed the maidservants standing by in the courtyard to attend to House Ying's ladies and invited them to sit down. After doing so, she then stood by the side and respectfully said, "Mrs., please wait a moment. Our 3rd young madam will be arriving shortly." Miss Fu cast a measuring gaze over senior servant Zhong. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't speak in the end. Miss Su thanked senior servant Zhong. Meanwhile, Miss Yuan teased in disapproval. "What? We're guests today. Is 6th sister really going to make us wait?" Miss Su frowned. Senior servant Zhong, on the other hand, stiffened and pressed her lips together before uttering an apology. "You're our 3rd young madam's esteemed guests. It's this old servant's fault for not inviting 3rd young madam over earlier." Miss Yuan's expression changed and she glared at senior servant Zhong. She hadn't expected this old servant to be so tactless. She was actually trying to protect Chu Lian, even at this time. Despite being just a lowly menial servant, she actually dared to retort to her. Miss Yuan was used to getting her way in the Ying estate. She was about to scold senior servant Zhong on the spot. However, before she could say another word, she was held back by Miss Su and Miss Fu. Even Miss Fu, who usually liked to sit back and watch the sparks fly, had tried to hold her back today. She immediately turned to Miss Fu with a glare. However, senior servant Zhong wasn't at all flustered by Miss Yuan's temper. She bobbed towards the 3 young ladies and continued as if nothing had happened. "This old servant will personally prepare some tea and snacks for the young misses. Please make yourself at home." Miss Yuan stared as senior servant Zhong walked right out of the courtyard. Then, she turned to her sisters with a face flushed red from frustration. "5th sister, 9th sister, look at that. Is that how 6th sister treats her guests? Why didn't you let me scold her?" Miss Su and Miss Fu weren't stupid. They weren't going to agree with Miss Yuan's blame towards Chu Lian. Miss Su furrowed her brows and put on a stern expression. "7th sister, that's enough from you. This isn't House Ying's 2nd branch. Don't take things too far." Miss Fu sneered. "That's right, don't throw our dignity out together with yours." Miss Yuan had been in a bad mood ever since entering Guilin Restaurant and seeing the novel arrangements within the building. And now adding on to that, her 2 sisters were even scolding her. Her face turned red with anger. However, there was no one here to back her up. Furthermore, ever since that incident at Jinsha Pavilion, she had learned to behave a little more. She wrung her handkerchief and managed to resist the urge to retort again. However, she had come here to see Chu Lian make a joke out of herself. How could Miss Yuan let her go so easily? She shot a glance at one of her handmaids, who then quickly brought out a container of food from behind her. In a moment, one of Guilin Restaurant's maidservants brought in freshly brewed tea. Steam billowed up from the cups, carrying a specially dry, bitter smell. Although House Ying was in decline, a starving camel was still larger than a horse. They had been carefully raised from a young age, so they could recognize that this was a loose-leaf tea from North Fujian. Although sencha brewing was now trending in the Great Wu dynasty, there were many different types of tea, separated by the region they came from. North Fujian loose-leaf tea was one of the main branches of tea. Loose-leaf tea fell into 2 categories, normal and high quality. However, if you weren't a tea enthusiast, it wasn't so easy to discern their quality. The 3 ladies of House Ying could only distinguish what type of sencha this was. However, they couldn't really tell much else about it. If it had been the former Chu Lian though, she might have been able to discern its quality. Miss Yuan sniffed and rolled her eyes. 6 sisters already opened a restaurant, how could she be so miserly as to serve her sisters this kind of tea? The maidservant who had brought in the tea was so embarrassed that her cheeks flushed red. She looked downwards, not daring to reply. When Miss Yuan noticed the maidservant's fingers trembling, she felt a little better. She turned to her handmaid and ordered, "Brew some tea for me." Her handmaid had a smug expression as she slowly brought out a fine porcelain container. She then purposely placed the porcelain container in front of Miss Su and Miss Fu to show it off a little. Chapter 245, Becoming Famous, 6. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Miss Su frowned. She could tell that this was a container of Zhongshan tea, one of the best quality sencha teas around. Every year, old Duke Ying would only be able to get 2 containers of this fine tea. Last year, old Duchess Ying had bestowed one of them to the second branch. She hadn't expected that this tea had somehow landed in Miss Yuan's hands. How could Miss Su know of the reason behind this? Miss Yuan was so determined to disgrace Chu Lian today that she had prepared a lot more than just some fine tea. Furthermore, she hadn't pleaded with her parents to get this tea, she had just stolen it directly out of her father's study. Miss Fu was shocked, but chose to remain quiet as she only pressed her lips together and watched on. "Miss Yuan, Miss Su was about to say something, but was interrupted by Miss Yuan before she could continue. "What's wrong, fifth sister? Look at how poorly they're treating their guests. Why can't I bring my own tea to drink? How was this poor treatment?" It was clearly Miss Yuan who was picking at the most trivial matters and making a mountain out of an anthill. The handmaid turned to Guilin Restaurant's maidservants to request for some tea brewing tools. However, another handmaid opened up the box of food. Without waiting for senior servant Zhong to come back with snacks, the second handmaid carefully brought out plate after plate of exquisite snacks and placed them on the table. This time, even Miss Fu had joined Miss Su in staring at Miss Yuan with a strange look in her eyes. They could tell that these snacks had come from Duran Restaurant. What's more, the plates had lotus flower patterns, so this was clearly the best assortment of snacks in the whole capital, as established by high-class society. Of course, it wasn't cheap. A small box of this assortment cost more than 10 taels. As young ladies of House Ying, their monthly allowances didn't even hit 10 taels. This time, Miss Yuan had really given an arm and a leg for her little ploy. Despite her sister's weird looks, the corners of Miss Yuan's lips lifted into a smile instead. "What are you doing, blanking out like that? Come and eat some. I got these snacks from Duran Restaurant. We don't get to eat these often in the estate." Miss Su's expression turned even sterner. To Miss Yuan, she warned, "Seventh sister, remember that we're here to give our congratulations and not for other motives." Miss Yuan reached out and picked up a piece of Osmanthus cake. "What are you thinking about, fifth sister? I haven't done anything at all, have I?" Chu Lian was currently attending to Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia in Earth Court 1 when a servant sent by Manager Qin came to report that her sisters from House Ying had arrived. When Royal Princess Duanjia heard the report, she immediately rolled her eyes. "What have they come here for?" Chu Lian smiled but didn't reply. She knew that Royal Princess Duanjia didn't like the ladies of House Ying. Lady Yang also wasn't someone who liked pandering to social niceties, so instead of bringing either of them with her, Chu Lian asked Royal Princess Duanjia to continue chatting with Lady Yang while she went over to attend to the ladies from her maiden house. While on her way, she met Senior Servant Zhong. Senior Servant Zhong hesitated for an instant, but she still reported the current situation in the courtyard to Chu Lian. Chu Lian looked at the maidservants carrying boxes of snacks behind Senior Servant Zhong and smiled. Although they could care less, we can't be remiss with our manners. Momo, send the snacks in anyway. Although Senior Servant Zhong looked down upon the ladies of House Ying thanks to their behavior, since Chu Lian had given the order, she couldn't disobey. She bobbed in acknowledgement and followed after Chu Lian, leading the 2 maidservants along with her. When Chu Lian noticed this, she was satisfied. Although He Sanlang had left these 3 servants to watch her, they were all useful to her in their own ways. The moment Chu Lian entered the courtyard, one of the maidservants announced her arrival. She entered the parlor of the little court and saw that her sisters had stood up to welcome her. However, only Miss Yuan had purposely stood further back to show off the items on the table. Chu Lian took one glance at the table and inwardly sneered. She just knew that this Miss Yuan would be up to no good. If not for the sake of maintaining peace between the two houses tied by marriage, she really wouldn't have sent any invitations at all to House Ying. Without waiting for Miss Su to speak, Miss Yuan had already started talking, her words dripping with sarcasm. Sixth sister must be really busy today. Even your own sisters have been cast off to one side. I wonder which esteemed guests sixth sister was attending to just now. Why didn't you introduce them to us so that we can make their acquaintance? The ladies here had heard a little about the friendship between Chu Lian and Prince Wei's estate. In Miss Yuan's eyes, Chu Lian had gotten her honored lady title thanks to her friendship with Royal Princess Duanjia. How could she not be jealous? Before Chu Lian had gotten married, she had been someone that Miss Yuan could bully anytime she wanted. However, right after marrying into House Jingen, Chu Lian's fortunes had suddenly changed. Seeing her getting along so well in life only made Miss Yuan grit her teeth in anger. Chu Lian gestured for her sisters to sit before addressing them with a warm smile. I was accompanying Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia earlier, so please pardon me for neglecting fifth sister, seventh sister, and ninth sister. However, Lady Yang doesn't like to interact with strangers, so I'm afraid I can't help with seventh sister's request. Throughout Chu Lian's entire address, Miss Yuan's expression had steadily turned even darker. She hadn't thought that Chu Lian would reject her so directly. However, she couldn't just force her to bring her to meet Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia. Thus, Miss Yuan could only do her best to exercise her self-restraint. She cast her eyes down, and upon seeing the snacks on the table, she harumphed coldly in her heart and an evil smile surfaced on her lips. Chapter 246, Becoming Famous, 7. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Even though Chu Lian wasn't too fond of this half-sister of hers, it was the grand opening of her restaurant today, so she couldn't really leave Miss Yuan hanging. She reached out and tugged at Miss Su's sleeve with a smile as she said, "It's about time now. Fifth sister, seventh sister, ninth sister, the kitchen will send our meal over soon." Miss Su quickly shot a glance at the table behind them before looking at Chu Lian again. When she noticed that Chu Lian's expression was calm, she inwardly heaved a sigh of relief before leading Chu Lian down to sit by the table. As much as Miss Su and Miss Fu wanted to avoid creating any awkward situations, with Miss Yuan around, how could that be possible? Miss Yuan sent another look at her handmaid. The handmaid then brought over a tray with the freshly brewed tea with an arrogant swagger to her walk. She kept her haughty expression even as she set a teacup in front of each of the ladies at the table. Miss Yuan picked up the white porcelain teacup and lifted it to her nose. After a short sniff, she acted as if she was drunk on the smell of the tea. She then smiled and boastfully said, "Sixth sister, I usually drink this Zhongshan tea at home, thanks to grandfather and grandmother's love for me. After getting used to it, I just can't drink any of this North Fujian loose-leaf tea of yours. I'm sure sixth sister has never had a chance to taste this Zhongshan tea before. Why don't you try some?" Chu Lian stared at Miss Yuan with her big, bright eyes that seemed like they could see through everyone's hearts. Miss Yuan didn't dare to meet that gaze and hurriedly looked away. Even though she should have been pleased with herself, there was a mysterious sense of guilt in her heart. Miss Su and Miss Fu stiffened in surprise and turned to Chu Lian with peculiar expressions. Chu Lian innocently blinked. "Thank you for the offer, seventh sister, but unfortunately, I don't like censure anymore." She had absolutely zero interest towards censure. Forget Zhongshan, even if it was the highest grade of tea straight from the imperial tribute itself, Chu Lian still wouldn't be interested. Seventh Miss Chu Yuan could slowly savor her precious Zhongshan tea by herself. Chu Lian's answer was completely out of Miss Yuan's expectations. She stared at Chu Lian with wide eyes, her true emotions completely revealed on her face despite her best efforts to hide them. How could that be? Back in the Ying estate, Chu Lian had taken utmost pride in her censure brewing skill. Even old Duke Ying had praised her for it once. At every special occasion or family banquet, she would always offer to brew some censure to show off her skills and earn the favor of the older members in their family. However, despite her skill in tea ceremony, she still wasn't able to get any high-quality tea in her hands. Miss Yuan always mocked her for that, even purposely wasting precious high-quality tea right in front of her eyes. Today, she had gotten this Zhongshan tea specifically to provoke her. How could Chu Lian say that she didn't like Sencha anymore? How could someone who had previously been so in love with Sencha suddenly change her mind? Was that even possible? All sorts of thoughts ran through Miss Yuan's head for a while before she finally managed to calm down. She found the perfect excuse for herself and decided that Chu Lian was just hiding her real emotions. She was probably going mad with envy and jealousy inside, and only acting as if nothing was wrong on the surface. Saying that she didn't want to drink the tea was just to avoid feeling sad over it. She had already figured out exactly what that Chu Lian was thinking. Since sixth sister doesn't like it, then the three of us will drink it together. After saying so, she took a sip right in front of Chu Lian, and even purposely started telling Miss Fu how sweet and aromatic the tea was and how it contained all sorts of flavors. If Chu Lian knew that Miss Yuan's abnormal behavior was meant to provoke her, she would have rolled her eyes directly at Miss Yuan. Since she was so good at jumping to conclusions, why didn't she just jump straight up to heaven? Conversely, Miss Su was the one who looked at Chu Lian with worry. Sixth sister, you used to love Sencha so much. Why don't you like it anymore? Chu Lian reassured her with a smile. I'm not sure why, but I just lost all liking for it. Now I prefer to drink honey water or fruit teas. Perhaps our taste buds just change with time. When Miss Su heard her explanation, she got lost a little in her thoughts. When she thought of how different Chu Lian's life had turned after marrying into House Jing'an, she didn't know whether she felt more sympathy or happiness for Chu Lian. Sixth sister said it well. You'll be happy as long as you follow your heart. Miss Yuan glanced at them from the corner of her eyes. Her mind was filled with hatred as she thought, keep acting, just keep acting. I want to see how long Chu Lian can keep acting for. Chu Lian didn't have any energy to waste on guessing Miss Yuan's thoughts. There was so much on her plate. There was no need to bother with a small fry like Miss Yuan who only knew how to jump up and down in a temper. She wasn't the original Chu Lian, so Miss Yuan was just a stranger to her. As long as Miss Yuan didn't go overboard, she wouldn't use any of her limited time and energy to deal with her. She wasn't the original Chu Lian anymore and she didn't share any of her past likes. If she suddenly changed all at once, it might draw unnecessary attention, so why not remind her maiden family bit by bit that she was slowly starting to change? She was no longer that Chu Lian who stayed hidden in the Ying estate. Telling them that she no longer liked Sencha was just the start. She believed that Miss Su would remember her words. As long as Miss Su knew this, Madame Rong would naturally find out about it as well, and if Madame Rong knew, then so did the entire Ying estate. Chapter 247, Becoming Famous, 8. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. When Miss Yuan saw that Miss Su was chatting happily with Chu Lian, her hands curled into fists. She took in a deep breath and purposely picked up one of the white square snacks on the table. With a voice a little louder than usual, she then said, "This white snow cake from Duran restaurant matches this Zhongshan so well. I heard grandmother say that Duran restaurant's confections are just as good as the ones in the palace." She then looked over to Chu Lian. Chu Lian waved over the maidservants behind her who were still carrying the boxes of snacks. "Fifth sister, seventh sister, ninth sister, would you like to try the confections from my Guilin restaurant?" Without waiting for Miss Su to reply, Miss Yuan cut in again, harumphing. "Sixth sister, aren't you overestimating yourself? You've just opened this restaurant and you don't have any secret recipes. How could your confections be better than Duran restaurants? Even if you make them look pretty, that's just deceiving people. Sixth sister, you should just pack these up so you don't dirty other people's eyes." Miss Yuan had gone overboard with her words. These were just some confections, how could they possibly dirty people's eyes? Miss Su shot a fierce glare towards Miss Yuan and quickly made to reassure Chu Lian. "Sixth sister, don't listen to her nonsense. Her personality has always been like this ever since she was little, and I'm sure you know that too. Don't take her words to heart. Bring out your confections, I want to try them." Chu Lian smiled at Miss Su first before looking at Miss Yuan. "If you don't like my confections, then you don't have to eat them, seventh sister." I wouldn't eat them even if you gave them to me. Let me tell you, I couldn't care less about your snacks, and I'm not going to eat a single bit of the banquet later." Mrs. Su and Fu were already stunned. Who could have expected the two ladies from the second branch to start fighting right in front of them? Chu Lian tilted her head as she looked at Miss Yuan without much change in expression. She only said, "Seventh sister is a guest here at my Guilin restaurant. Of course seventh sister is free to do as she likes." After saying so, without a second look at Miss Yuan, she turned to instruct the maidservants on arranging the trays of snacks on the table. Multicolored round little sponge cakes, steamed vermicelli rolls, Osmanthus chestnut biscuits, specially made heart-shaped jujube paste cakes. Various types of snacks were placed in porcelain dishes of a variety of different shapes. They looked like miniature art pieces meant only for admiring, not to be touched, let alone to be eaten. Each of the confections were made to be about the size of a quail egg, just about enough for 2 bites, and each tray contained just 3 or 4 pieces. That was just enough for them to have something to snack on with the tea and still have room to enjoy the banquet later on. A light fragrance drifted up from the exquisite, elegant pastries. They were placed right next to the ones from Duran restaurant. As long as you don't compare things, there's no harm done. Duran restaurant's confections looked quite beautiful until they were set right next to Guilin restaurant's. They seemed like fine delicacies at first, but now they seemed like a poor man's fare. The contrast was too great to ignore. As blind as Miss Yuan was, she could also tell that Duran restaurant's confections just couldn't be compared to Guilin restaurant's. Miss Fu let out a gasp of shock. "Sixth sister, these confections are so beautiful. Have a taste." After they placed the round sponge cakes into their mouths, they could feel the soft and sticky texture of the cake as its unique aroma enveloped their tongues. It wasn't too sweet and even carried a slight bitterness, almost like tea. Miss Su and Miss Fu's eyes widened in surprise. Even the normally steady Miss Su's face had a mixed expression of shock and enjoyment. Although Miss Fu carried hidden motives, she was still a young girl. When she found something she liked, she wouldn't conceal her happiness. "Sixth sister, what is this one called? It's so tasty." Chu Lian pointed at each of the confections and gave a simple introduction of each one. Miss Yuan stared at Miss Su and Miss Fu in disbelief. She ground her teeth in frustration as her gaze landed upon the confections on the table. Although she was about to explode from the pent-up emotions in her heart, saliva pooled in her mouth. If not for those words she had said earlier, she would already have grabbed a piece to try for herself and see exactly how tasty these confections were. Hidden under her broad sleeves, Miss Yuan's right hand gathered into a fist. The satisfied expressions of Miss Su and Miss Fu as they ate the confections had become the greatest ridicule to her. She reached out with one hand, seemingly headed towards the tray of Guilin restaurant's confections, but she turned and picked up a confection from Duran restaurant's tray instead. When she placed the white snow cake in her mouth, she could no longer taste the same feeling of sweetness and satisfaction. Chu Lian noticed all of her actions, but didn't say anything. This was what Chu Yuan decided for herself, and she couldn't blame anyone else. Furthermore, the only consequence was that Chu Yuan wouldn't be able to eat anything from her Guilin restaurant. That couldn't be counted as any sort of punishment. After 15 minutes, the trays of confections were cleared away by the maidservants. Out of sight, out of mind. Miss Yuan's stiff expression loosened a little. However, before she could take a moment's respite, Chu Lian had already ordered senior servant Zhong to bring in the banquet. It was then that Chu Yuan realized her torture had just begun, thanks to her presumptuous actions. Chu Lian couldn't continue accompanying her sisters from House Ying alone, since she still had to attend to Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia. She also had to check in with the male guests in the outer court, since she was the real owner of Guilin restaurant. Miss Yuan still had some integrity in her. Right after Chu Lian left, she took the chance to escape and immediately left Guilin restaurant. Miss Su and Miss Fu couldn't let her leave alone, so they notified senior servant Zhong. Leaving behind their apologies and gifts, they followed Miss Yuan back to the Ying estate. Miss Yuan had lost her bait along with the fish today. She had come to pick at Chu Lian, only to slap herself in the face and become a sorry sight. Chapter 248, You don't have to come back anymore. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Later that day, when Miss Yuan returned to the Ying estate, Second Master Chu Chizheng found out that she had stolen his tea. The two of them started a fight and ended up bearing a grudge against each other. When Chu Lian found out about this much later on, she merely acted like someone had told her a good joke. Back at Guilin Restaurant, in the outer court meant for male guests, a group of nobles of various ages were sitting together at a table. The eldest there was old Duke Sheng, while the youngest was the young Marquis Wei Yuan. These people wouldn't normally mingle, but had been brought together today thanks to Chu Lian's amazing food. All of them chose to simply enjoy the delicacies before them and avoid bringing up any topic related to politics. After half a month of rest and eating the food carefully made by Mingyang, old Duke Sheng was now hale and hearty like before. There was even a healthy flush on his nose, and he seemed full of energy. Old Duke Sheng had recently fallen in love with spicy poached fish. He would order it for every meal back at the Zheng estate. The snow-white fish slices looked even more fresh and tender when floating in a pool of spicy red chili oil. They looked so soft that they might even make him swallow his tongue by accident. He had thought that poached fish slices were the highest level of gourmet food. However, it was only today at Guilin Restaurant that he discovered how wrong he was. When a manservant came in and placed a plate of grilled fish on the table, old Duke Sheng's eyes almost popped out from surprise. Guilin Restaurant used the most tender freshwater fish from the Minute River to make this spicy grilled fish dish. The specially selected freshwater fish had to be at their freshest when killed. The fish's flesh had to remain soft and tender when cooked, while the outer layer of skin had to be grilled to a crispy brown. The natural oiliness was wrung out before grilling, so afterwards, all that was left was the soft, slippery flesh and the crispy fish skin. Then before eating, one could dip the grilled slices into the accompanying chili sauce. After swallowing that down, they couldn't resist taking bite after bite after bite. Their chopsticks couldn't stop grabbing more fish and placing it in their mouths until the tip of their tongues turned numb. However, that only enhanced their enjoyment of this delicacy. In addition to the fish was also a few side dishes, like fresh bean sprouts, lettuce, roasted chestnuts, and other bright green leafy vegetables. These ordinary vegetables were cooked using the juices from the fish, so they had a different, addictive taste than what they were used to. All the men seated in the parlor had completely forgotten to make small talk while gorging on the delicious food before them. When they finally set their chopsticks down, their noses had long since turned runny. Seeing this, the manservants behind them passed over some wet towels for them. Old Duke Zheng wiped away his snot in satisfaction. It was already autumn, but thanks to the spicy food they had just eaten, there was a fine layer of sweat on their foreheads. Even though this was a rather wretched appearance for a noble man, old Duke Zheng still gave a shout of amazing in compliment of the food. This made the manservants behind them sweat from embarrassment. Marquis Wei Yuan's taste buds tended more towards light flavors. He couldn't really take spicy food. However, when he saw everyone's chopsticks reaching out for that steaming hot plate of grilled fish, he couldn't resist the temptation. He swallowed his saliva before reaching towards that square plate as well. After eating 2 slices of grilled fish, Marquis Wei Yuan was almost tearing up from the spiciness. His originally pink lips had also turned red and swollen, almost on the verge of turning into mini sausages. While rubbing at his lips with one hand, he still couldn't help picking up more fish with the other. He had totally lost his usually noble, handsome bearing. Right now, he was just a greedy foodie with a voracious appetite without any care for his image. The heads of the manservants sunk even lower. Each of them tried their best to sink into the floor in shame. Were these men really nobles? Look at the way they were fighting for food. Mingyang had also followed old Duke Sheng to Guilin Restaurant today. She wasn't actually allowed to be in the parlor with the nobles, so she hid behind a screen and peeked in. The manservants in this parlor had all been personally chosen by Manager Qin for their quick wits. Old Duke Zheng had only brought a single maidservant today, so it was obvious that she wasn't just a normal maidservant. Thus, they simply closed one eye towards her peeping. Anyway, she was just watching from behind a screen and wasn't doing anything overboard. Mingyan's face had turned pale while she was watching the nobles eat. When her gaze landed on the large dining table in the middle of the parlor, she suddenly realized that she had never seen a single one of the dishes on the table before. Mingyan's heart sank. What was this? How had third young madam come up with so many new dishes? Could it be that she had even more secret recipes in hand? Lost in her shock, Mingyang leaned on one of the carved flowers on the screen's frame, almost causing it to fall over due to her weight. Luckily, a manservant standing nearby noticed it in time and quickly caught the screen. The manservant then unhappily said, "Excuse me, miss. If you're not needed here, please leave this parlor. If there's an accident, we won't be able to make up for it even with our lives." Mingyang finally recovered her senses and rationality. She hurriedly thanked the manservant and then stumbled her way out of the parlor with her thoughts in a mess. TL note: I can't take spicy foods like Marquis Weiyuan, so the sight of all these chilies is scary to me. TVT grilled fish in chili. Another grilled fish. The term the author used for the fish is very generic, so I can't tell what the exact type of fish it is that they're eating. It generally refers to any type of fish raised in a very pure river with clear waters. Chapter 249, You Don't Have to Come Back Anymore. 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Could it be that third young madam had hidden most of her secret recipes from them when she was back at Songtao Court? No, that was impossible. Third young madam never evaded them whenever she cooked. She even personally taught them her secret recipes. She wasn't silly, so she had earnestly remembered and picked up whatever third young madam had taught them. Third young madam was just a normal person. How could she have an endless store of secret recipes? Even if she had more than a few of them, after all this time, Mingyang should have finished learning all of them. Why were there suddenly even more dishes that she had never seen before? Actually, Mingyang had only learned about 20 or so dishes. That number was just a drop in the ocean for the great foodie Chu Lian, who had eaten most of the foods on either side of the Yangtze River. It was only Mingyang herself who had thought that she had learned all of the secret recipes that third young madam's family had passed down. Judging from the scene just now, Guilin Restaurant's dishes had clearly stolen away old Duke Sheng's favor. How was she going to gain a foothold in the Zheng estate by old Duke Sheng's side now? As she continued to think, Mingyan's mood worsened. She wasn't satisfied. She had already bravely taken the first step away from Chu Lian. She definitely wasn't going to return. She paced about in the corridor outside the parlor, the handkerchief in her hands already wrung into knots. Finally, she made a decision and quickly strode out of the courtyard. She asked directions from a manservant before moving quickly towards the kitchen. However, before she could enter, she was blocked by a tall server guarding the kitchen. "Miss, please stop there. Outsiders are not allowed in Guilin Restaurant's kitchen." Mingyang lowered her head and trembled imperceptibly. In the next moment, she had already made up her mind. Mingyang raised her head and met the server's sharp gaze. Then, she declared, "I'm third young madam's handmaid and I've come here under her orders to handle some affairs in the kitchen. How dare you stop me?" The originally confident server froze for a moment and was at a loss for what to do when a familiar voice sounded from behind Mingyang. "Zhong, go inside and help. Leave this to me." The speaker was Xian. Xian often came to Guilin Restaurant to teach the cooks new dishes, so the staff here were all familiar with her. The server called Zhong immediately saluted to Xian before entering the kitchen. Mingyan's body was rooted to the spot. She hadn't expected Xian to come to the kitchen at this time. However, her next thought calmed her down. She wasn't doing anything against her conscience here. Furthermore, while serving old Duke Sheng, he didn't treat her as a maidservant at all. Even if she claimed to be old Duke Sheng's granddaughter, others might believe it. Her current status was higher than Xian's, so she could hold her head high and keep her back straight. "Miss Mingyang, you've been taking care of His Grace all this time. How could I not have noticed when third young madam sent you some orders?" Xian mocked. This Mingyang seemed honest enough before when they still spent day after day working beside one another. Who could have thought that she would have such a disloyal heart? She even tried to fake third young madam's orders. If she really entered the kitchen, who knew what kind of disaster might occur? Today was Guilin Restaurant's first banquet. It was an extremely important day, and there was no room for mistakes. Mingyang could sense Xian's distance in her tone. She frowned and scolded Xian in her heart. However, she still forced a smile on her face. She walked over to Xian's side and said, "Sister Xian, you've mistaken me. I just noticed that the dishes that Guilin restaurant brought out today were all new, so I wanted to come over and broaden my horizons a little. I didn't have any other intentions." Xian tugged her arm away from Mingyan's hold and looked at her with a cold expression. "You had better not have any other intentions. If there's nothing, you should go back to His Grace's side. Guilin restaurant's dishes are all made from secret recipes, so the kitchen isn't a place for outsiders to enter." There was no courtesy left in Xian's very direct words. She wasn't someone who liked to beat around the bush anyway. Furthermore, this Mingyang was annoying, so Xian just spoke however she liked. Mingyang couldn't hold the smile on her face any longer. She stomped her foot in rage. "Sister Xian, what do you mean by that? You're treating me as an outsider?" Even when third young madam was cooking back in the estate, she never minded letting me watch. That was because you were still third young madam's handmaid back then. You were someone who served third young madam. However, your current master is Duke Zheng. Only whenever you start serving third young madam again is when everything will be as before. After throwing down these words, Xian couldn't be bothered to continue talking to this ingrate. She quickly turned and entered the kitchen, leaving just the sight of her back for Mingyang. Mingyang glared at the kitchen door for a long moment. However, in the end, she could only spit at the door and stomp her foot once more before leaving. Following that, Mingyang tried searching for Jingyan and Fuyan. However, they were currently serving by Chu Lian's side, so she wasn't able to meet them. With an uneasy and impatient heart, Mingyang returned to wait outside the parlor with tumultuous feelings. Right as she reached the entrance of the parlor, she could hear old Duke Zheng's booming voice from within. After a moment of hesitation, she walked forward and came even closer to the parlor. "Genie, it's good that you opened this restaurant. This old man will have a place to eat from now on." That was old Duke Zheng's voice, brimming full of undisguised joy. "Then Guilin restaurant will be depending on old Duke Zheng from now on." Chu Lian's voice was uniquely gentle and bright, very pleasing to the ear. "Oh yes, these few days, I've been recovering well, all thanks to the maidservant you left in my estate. Her skills aren't bad at all. However, my body's almost fully recovered and I can't keep your personal handmaid away from you. Why don't you send someone to take her back today?" Chu Lian blinked and smiled. "It seems like Mingyang has gotten your Grace's favor. This junior has enough servants. Since your Grace likes her skills, there's no need to send her back. This junior will send that girl's contract over to the estate some other day. That girl has learned quite a few of my secret recipes after all. Your Grace, you have to accept this present from your humble junior." Chapter 250, Aftermath of Becoming Famous, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. What? Third young madam wanted to give her away to the Zhang estate? Mingyan's eyes almost popped out in shock and disbelief. Taking the initiative to abandon someone and getting abandoned were completely different matters. Old Duke Zhang looked at Chu Lian with a thought-provoking expression. He had been involved in politics for many years, so he could see the real reason behind Chu Lian's actions without much effort. He thought that Chu Lian would feel awkward or ashamed under his stare, but unexpectedly, there wasn't even the slightest hint of a blush on her face. Her eyes remained bright and clear, even reflecting some degree of amusement. When their gazes met, it was he who felt uneasy first. After freezing for a moment, old Duke Zheng burst out into laughter. "Fine. Since it's a token of Genie's regard, this old man will accept it." Chu Lian bobbed slightly towards old Duke Zheng. "Mingyang is blessed to be able to take care of your Grace. All right, child. There's no need for all those wishy-washy pleasantries at my age. If that girl serves me sincerely, then I'll treat her fairly. Now, Genie, you'll have to leave a small court for me here at your new restaurant." Chu Lian smiled and agreed to it with a nod. Marquis Weiyuan wanted to ask Chu Lian for a court here as well, but unfortunately, with old Duke Zheng sitting at the same table, he didn't dare to speak up. He could only scratch his ear and wait for a chance to ask he Daling later instead. While the people inside the parlor were chatting away warmly, Mingyang was slowly freezing over outside. She was really going to be one of the servants of the Zheng estate from now on. When she thought back to the past few months at Songtao court, they didn't seem real now. Mingyang pressed her lips together and raised her head. The glint in her eyes shone with resolution. This was the road she had chosen for herself, and there was no longer any space to retreat. Compared to living in that small courtyard back in the Jingen estate and serving a living widow, why not try her luck in the Zheng estate? She still had third young madam's secret recipes anyway. Once she gained a foothold in the Zheng estate, she would be able to stand up straight in front of third young madam in the future. She was going to make sure that third young madam regretted abandoning her today. A trace of hatred flashed across Mingyan's eyes. After getting rid of a burden, Chu Lian felt refreshed. She returned to Earth Court 1 accompanied by Wenqing and Wenlan. The days of an empty main hall and deserted entrance were gone. A huge crowd was gathered outside Guilin Restaurant's plain entrance, drawing a striking comparison with the past. If not for the servers constantly reassuring the crowd outside, the customers would all have charged into the restaurant by now. The 30 lucky customers who had drawn the winning lots had already been ushered in and given seats. The servers were shouting in a lively manner as they passed back and forth between the tables and served up food. 4 cold dishes and 8 hot ones, together with 1 soup, were all placed on the tables in just a few moments. There were 13 dishes representing the 13 great guardians for an auspicious opening. This was the first time most of the common folk had seen such a luxurious spread for a banquet. There were all sorts of cooking methods represented by at least 1 dish on the table: steaming, boiling, frying, and even grilling. 2 dishes drew everyone's attention: a large plate of poached fish swimming in chili oil and a plate of golden brown, crispy fried chicken. The spicy fish dish was extremely new to the commoners, so the servers gave a short introduction when it was served. Duran Restaurant's Mr. Wang loved hunting for and trying out new dishes. As he listened to the server introducing this strange-looking dish, his eyes almost popped out of his head. On the way here to Guilin Restaurant, he had already gotten one of his servers to investigate the owner of this restaurant. It was one of House Jingen's businesses, but it wasn't clear who the real owner was. However, his server had mentioned spotting House Ying's carriage outside just now, so Mr. Wang had a good guess as to who the owner was. Looking again at this table of novel dishes, Mr. Wang was 90% certain that it was that person. He had heard about the incident with the longevity peach buns at the Dingyuan estate. Since he had been the one to make those longevity peach buns, it wasn't weird at all that he knew about what happened then. He had always wanted to meet this third young madam of House Jingen, that is, the current honored Lady Jeannie. If all these brand new dishes had come from that honored lady, then there was nothing unjust about this whole situation. He would willingly admit his loss. Mr. Wang reached out and grabbed a piece of poached fish with his chopsticks. Chu Lian had been afraid that the people in this era wouldn't be accustomed to eating spicy flavors, so she had prepared the chilies accordingly. After drying the chilies, they wouldn't be as spicy when used in cooking. There was only a mild spicy taste to the fish, but that was already enough to shock all the foodies present. The snow-white fish slices were smooth and tender. They practically melted in the mouth without any chewing required and carried the faint fragrance of chili. It was very appetizing. Mr. Wang's eyes widened as he savored this new sensation. He couldn't wait to try all the other dishes. As he tried each and every one, the pleasant surprise in his eyes only grew brighter. By the time he had tasted all the dishes on the table at least once, he had already lost all traces of his previous calm. Amazing. Amazing. Who could have known that such normal ingredients could bring out such an addictive taste? He was starting to believe that Guilin Restaurant could really live up to its reputation. The boasts that manager Qin had made earlier to attract the attention of the crowd weren't too exaggerated at all. He believed that the name of this old restaurant that had been hidden for more than 10 years in the Old West Market would be spread all across the capital by tomorrow. TL note: You've already seen the poached fish slices just a few chapters back. The fried chicken in the story is most likely this famous Taiwanese street food. Taiwanese fried chicken. The 13 Great Guardians is a story about Li Qiong and his 13 generals who suppressed a rebel army and chased them out of the capital during the Tang dynasty. It's based on actual historic events. There was a movie adaptation, and this Wikipedia article provides an English summary of the movie plot, with some deviations from actual history. https://en. Wikipedia. Org Wiki. The_heroic_ones. You can read more about the history of Li Qiong through his Wikipedia article. https://en. Wikipedia. Org Wiki Li_Qiong. Chapter 251, Aftermath of Becoming Famous, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Mr. Wang suddenly recalled that some of his old friends would be coming to the capital soon. If those old fellows were to taste these dishes, they would probably become addicts on the spot. By the time Mr. Wang finally regained his senses, there were only scattered dishes and cups left on the table. He gaped in shock with his chopsticks still raised in his right hand. All the dishes had been completely emptied. Some of the customers had even poured the remaining bits of sauce into their bowls and scarfed it down with rice. Damn it, I've lived for over 30 years and I've never tasted anything as delicious as this before, lamented a stocky middle-aged man wearing a short tunic. Mr. Wang slammed his chopsticks on the table in a fit of anger. Although he looked down on this group of people for wolfing down all the food without any manners at all, he realized that he would have acted the same way if he hadn't been lost in his thoughts. Actually, Mr. Wang had the same laments as that stocky man. Compared to that man's 30 years of life, the 50-year-old Mr. Wang was starting to think that all the food he had eaten before had gone to waste. After eating such amazing food, he felt that the past 50 years of his life were spent living in hell. The excitement of Guilin Restaurant's opening finally drew to a close. Now that the opening had officially ended, the Old West Market started to recover some of its usual peace and quiet. When night fell, Chu Lian returned to the Jing'an estate together with her servants. Manager Qin would take care of the remaining business at Guilin Restaurant, so she didn't have to do anything else. When she returned to the estate, she first reported everything over at Qingxi Hall before returning to her Songtao court. Senior servant Gui knew what Chu Lian's habits were like. After such a busy day, Chu Lian was definitely going to take a good rest. Thus, she had already prepared some soup for Chu Lian. After Chu Lian took a bath and ate some red bean porridge, she immediately entered her bedroom and laid down. The next day, before the sun had even risen, the narrow entrance of the Old West Market seemed to have regained some of its past glory. It wasn't just the richer common folk who had gathered there. There were even expensive-looking carriages from different noble estates lined up at the market's entrance. In order to stay close to Guilin Restaurant and be at hand for any matters, Manager Qin slept in one of the courtyards at the back of Guilin Restaurant. Now that the opening day was over, it was as if a burden had lifted from everyone's hearts. When it was time to rest at night, their hearts and minds had already completely relaxed. However, before they could get a good night's sleep, someone knocked loudly at Guilin Restaurant's entrance. Manager Qin struggled to open his eyes. He got off the bed and pushed the windows open a little. When he saw that it was still dark outside and that the moon was still hanging high in the sky, he guessed that it was around 4 in the morning. Just as he was about to return to bed and continue sleeping, there was a knock on the door of his room. Manager Qin, wake up. Come over to the entrance and take a look. Someone charged into the restaurant. What? Manager Qin was shocked wide awake thanks to the furious knocks on his door and the anxious tone of the server outside. He didn't bother trying to go back to bed and instead tugged on his outer robe and opened the door. What's going on? The server was carrying a lantern. When he noticed that Manager Qin looked like he had just gotten out of bed, he quickly explained, the entrance was filled with people. For some reason, Zhong opened the door and those people just charged right in. They've been making a ruckus about reserving a table. I was going to call more of our staff to chase them off, but some of the people in the crowd look like the stewards of a noble house. The main hall's already full, so it's hard to ask them to leave now. The server's face was creased with worry. He was sweating with tension, having to deal with this situation late at night. Furthermore, one of the manservants had reported that one of the doors had been broken from the crowd squeezing in. Other people worried about whether they would get enough business. However, their Gwaelin restaurant had to worry about how they were going to chase away their customers. When this thought passed through the server's head, he had to resist the urge to sigh. Manager Cheen had first thought that some hoodlums were trying to cause trouble for them. Who could have expected that it was actually their customers? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but he didn't dare to tarry. He changed into decent clothes and followed the server out to the main hall to deal with the situation. Although their owner was House Jingen's third young madam, there were too many nobles in the capital. A single moment of carelessness could mean accidentally offending some noble family and bringing disaster upon themselves. In the dark of the night, Manager Cheen and a few of his more capable subordinates got to work. It wasn't until daybreak that they finally appeased this crowd of people and got them settled. However, without even giving him the time to take a short break or even a sip of water, another crowd arrived. There were a few middle-aged men in the lead. Before they got to the entrance of Gwaelin restaurant, they pointed out the entrance to the people behind them with smiles on their faces. At this distance, he couldn't tell what they were saying. It wasn't even time for the restaurant to open, but Manager Cheen was already sitting by the reception counter with a cup of tea. When he saw that 20 or more people were walking towards them from afar, he felt his head go numb. Those people weren't here to have a meal or reserve a table, right? Their tables had been booked all the way up till next month. As wise as Manager Cheen was, he had never experienced such a situation before. In the end, he sent someone to report this matter to Chu Lian. Fortunately, he was given a solution to deal with this problem at least temporarily. Chapter 252, Getting Rich, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. In the blink of an eye, the name of the old restaurant that had almost been buried in the sands of time was now known throughout the entire capital. The song that had been sung on the day of the opening, Song of Heroes, spread through all the roads and alleyways of the city. The sounds of little children singing The Great Rivers All Run to the East were heard often by the people passing by on the streets. The little courts in the back of Gwaelin restaurant had been practically booked full by the famous, powerful officials of the capital. Furthermore, the price to reserve a court increased day by day. Even though the customers knew very well that Gwaelin restaurant was doing it on purpose to earn their precious silver, there were still people who had money and were willing to spend it. On the other hand, the main hall in the front of Gwaelin restaurant was open to all regardless of status. The prices were also much more fair. Unfortunately, in order to have a meal there, customers had to reserve a seat at least 1 month in advance. Seeing that the demand for a table at Gwaelin restaurant far outstripped the supply, the majority of the capital was waiting with bated breath for Gwaelin restaurant to expand their business or even open up more branches. However, there was no movement at all on the part of Gwaelin restaurant, just like an old monk who had already settled into meditation. The number of available tables per day remained the same as well, and they refused to add even just one more to the main hall. Before the sky would even turn dark, Gwaelin restaurant would close its doors for the night. This frustrated many of the foodies waiting to have a taste of its novel dishes. However, even so, Gwaelin restaurant wasn't forgotten by the masses. Rather, they became even more famous instead. The more scholarly customers who had managed to have a meal there would even lament, if you travel to the capital and leave without having a taste of Gwaelin restaurant's food, your trip was completely wasted. Those with money to burn would spend great amounts of silver to eat at Gwaelin restaurant every day, thinking that they would eventually be able to wean themselves off of this addiction. However, before they could even get tired of eating the dishes currently available, Gwaelin restaurant would bring out brand new dishes every month, without any repeats. The rich, the noble, and even the despotic would eat the dishes here with tears of joy, unable to escape this heavenly trap. The daily flow of customers to Gwaelin restaurant brought new life to the Old West Market, making the whole street much more livelier. In just 2 months, the normal residences around Gwaelin restaurant had already opened up shopfronts and began to do business on the street. The Old West Market was now bustling with noise and excitement, a far cry from its comparatively silent streets not too long ago. It had been a whole month since Guilin Restaurant had opened. Today was the day that manager Qin would meet Chu Lian to check over the account books. Xian was even more anxious than Chu Lian was. Early in the morning, while on duty to serve by Chu Lian's side, she was so nervous that she even accidentally spilled some honey water. When Chu Lian saw this, she found it funny. "Xian, why are you so absent-minded today?" Xian thought that she might as well set down the teapot in her hands. She walked over to Chu Lian's side and took a light purple outer coat with a pattern of entwined branches from a young maidservant standing by, and then helped Chu Lian put it on. "Third young madam, aren't you the slightest bit worried? Manager Qin will be sending over the account books today." Chu Lian let Xian help her with her belt before reaching out for a teacup and taking a sip of the warm water. She nodded and said, "I know. What's there to be worried about?" After Xian finished dressing Chu Lian, she felt a sense of helplessness rising within her. "Third young madam, don't you want to know if Guilin Restaurant has made a profit or loss this first month? If the restaurant didn't manage to turn a profit, then you'll be 2,000 taels in the red. That's all the money you have at hand. Won't your heart bleed?" Right after she said that, Xian visibly became even more tense. This little brat, why was she acting as if the money used to renovate Guilin Restaurant had come from her own pockets? Chu Lian still found this funny. "There's nothing to be worried about. There's no question that we'll be able to earn it back." "Ah!" Xian's mouth gaped wide open in disbelief. "Third young madam, did you know this, even before you renovated the restaurant?" "Of course I did, otherwise, why would I have gone ahead with my plans?" Xian hurriedly shook her head and kept quiet. No one else would have that sort of confidence. There was no one else who knew better than she what third young madam had sacrificed to open Guilin Restaurant. In order to get the funds for the renovation and opening, third young madam had taken all the gold accessories she had and gave them to senior servant Gui to melt. 2,000 taels wasn't a small sum. Even the most experienced merchants wouldn't have the spirit to put all of their eggs, their entire fortune, in a single basket. Xian was speechless with amazement. The only thought she had in mind was that her third young madam was incredible. Actually, Chu Lian wasn't as incredible as Xian thought she was. She simply didn't treat money as all that important. In her eyes, even if she lost the 2,000 taels she had invested, it wouldn't matter too much. She would still be House Jingen's third young madam and be able to eat good food all day. Furthermore, she wasn't all that bad at business in the first place, at least not to the point that she would lose all her capital. If Xian were to find out that the master she greatly admired had thoughts like that, she would definitely roll her eyes. Chapter 253, Getting Rich, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. In the afternoon, Manager Qin came to the estate dressed in a new purplish-blue robe. Chu Lian met him in the parlor of Songtao Court. Perhaps due to a whole month of good business, as well as Guilin Restaurant's good food, the young Manager Qin seemed to have become fatter. His originally slim body had turned into a potbelly, giving the maidservants the urge to sweat. "Third young madam, this is Guilin Restaurant's account book for the past month." Manager Qin bowed respectfully towards Chu Lian before offering up the account book with two hands. Chu Lian flipped through 1 or 2 pages of the book before setting it aside. "Manager Qin, give me a short summary of the accounts. I'll keep this account book and go through it in detail over the next few days." Manager Qin couldn't wait for Chu Lian to ask him about the accounts. He had learned how to manage shops by following his father around since he was young. Later on, as the years passed, he was able to manage businesses by himself. Perhaps due to the influence of his younger years, he was able to turn a normal store into a profitable business at the tender age of 15. He was already in his 20s now, but this Guilin Restaurant was one of the most successful businesses he had ever managed. Thus, he couldn't wait to show off his achievements to Chu Lian. When Xian heard the number that Manager Qin reported, she froze on the spot from shock. 3,580 taels. That was after subtracting the running expenses for Guilin Restaurant. That is to say, Guilin Restaurant had turned a profit of 3,580 taels alone this month. Heavens! Taking away the 2,000 taels of initial capital that Chu Lian had invested in Guilin Restaurant at the start, that was still 1,800 taels of pure profit. What kind of concept was that? Xian's mind immediately turned blank. Chu Lian had already expected a profit from Guilin Restaurant, so she wasn't as shocked as Xian was. However, even so, that amount had completely exceeded her expectations for the first month. She had really underestimated the spending power of the people in the capital. After asking manager Qin for a few more details, it was only an hour later that senior servant Gui escorted manager Qin out. Chu Lian opened up the wooden box of money that manager Qin had left behind and took out 2 bills to pass to Xian. Keep these for Songtao Court's daily expenses. Mother's birthday is coming, so we can use that chance to give out some rewards for all the people in our courtyard. You can decide what to do with the rest of the money by yourself. Xian held the 200 tael banknotes in her hands and spoke with disbelief in her tone. Third young madam, all this is from Guilin Restaurant's profit? Chu Lian glared at her speechlessly. Of course. Do you want to count through all the notes in this box and see if it's really 1,000 taels? Xian quickly shook her head. No, this servant doesn't have to count it. This servant trusts that there's 1,000 taels in there. Third young madam, you're amazing. This servant just can't really believe it. Back in the Ying estate, it would have taken us quite a few years to save up 100 taels. Chu Lian blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this girl to think back to the past. All right, don't think about those things now. I'm not the 6th Miss of House Ying anymore. I'm now House Jing'an's third young madam and an honored lady personally named by the emperor. Xian rubbed away the tears that had leaked out unconsciously from her eyes. That's right. Young madam's days are much better now. If only third young master could be by young madam's side, then all would be well. Xian's words made Chu Lian's face stiffen. Her days had been too carefree, she had almost forgotten that she had a husband who had gone off to the northern border. She wondered how that crazy, unfortunate husband of hers was doing. She hadn't gotten any letters from him for a month. Maybe the blank letters she had sent him had upset him and made him even more unhinged. Chu Lian shook her head. What was she doing thinking about He Sanlang? It was more important to pass her days in peace. She remembered that the great Dr. Miao was supposed to appear in the capital around this time. Chu Lian blinked and the corners of her lips lifted up in excitement. With her here, she wasn't going to let that Xiaobo Jian get to great Dr. Miao first. Sometimes, you really can't speak of the devil. Not even an hour had passed since she had thought about how He Sanlang hadn't sent any letters back for a while, when senior servant Liu personally came over to Songtao Court with some maidservants in tow. Chu Lian stood up to welcome her. Senior servant Liu was wearing an azure cloak lined with down. Her hair was pressed flat to her face thanks to the outside winds, and it looked like she had rushed all the way here. Momo, please come in and sit. Have a cup of hot tea. Chu Lian quickly ordered Fuyan to serve some tea. It was already October and the weather was turning cold. Winters in the capital were always bitterly cold and dry. Senior servant Liu was clearly in high spirits as she took out a thick letter from her sleeve without waiting for the tea. She passed the letter to Chu Lian and said, "Third young madam, third young master personally wrote this for you. Look, it's such a thick letter, too." Chu Lian's lips parted in surprise as she took the parcel. Whose husband sent letters back? It was only then that senior servant Liu took a seat and sighed. If it isn't so. There was another letter for the matriarch as well. These were just sent here by a soldier from the post house. He said that there was a huge snowstorm near the northern border and the highways between the cities were blocked. We were supposed to get this letter about half a month ago, but it was delayed thanks to the snowstorm. I heard the northern border is supposed to be many times colder than the capital. Third young master has never been to the northern border before. I wonder if he'll be able to get used to the weather there. As senior servant Liu spoke, her eyes started to redden and the tears gathered in her eyes fell. Amongst the 3 young masters in House Jing'an, senior servant Liu cared the most for He Changdi. Back then, after Countess Jing'an had given birth to He Changdi, her health had taken a turn for the worse and He Sanlang had been practically raised by his grandmother. Senior servant Liu had taken care of He Sanlang alongside his nursemaid. Chu Lian had gotten lost in her thoughts after hearing senior servant Liu's words. The weather at the northern border had already turned cold, and it was already snowing in the nearby cities. So early. There was no longer any trace of the excitement and joy she had had earlier. Instead, her brows drew together in tension. This was the first time senior servant Liu had seen such an expression on third young madam. She thought that her words had caused third young madams to worry, so she quickly wiped away her tears and forced herself into using a happier tone. "Ah, it's this old servant's fault. Third young madam, please don't worry. Although third young master looks a little skinny due to his height, he has been practicing martial arts alongside the count and his brothers ever since he was a child, and his very skill. The weather at the northern border must be nothing to him. Furthermore, all we've heard is some hearsay from others, so it might not be true. See, third young master sent out his letters after all. Third young madam, why don't you open it up and see what third young master has written?" Chapter 254, My Dear Wife Madam Chu, Treat This Letter Like My Person. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. After noticing senior servant Liu's expectant expression, Chu Lian could only tear open the letter on the spot. As expected, there was a thick stack of paper within. Chu Lian didn't know what to expect. She had never received a reply from He Sanlang before. If it was anything like those ghastly brushstrokes of his last time, it would be a miracle if she could make out what he wrote. Chu Lian took out the papers from the envelope and prepared herself for some major squinting and headaches to make out He Sanlang's terrible writing. However, when she looked at the letters, it seemed like he had actually put effort into his writing this time. The brushstrokes on the paper looked beautiful and refined, yet bold and powerful at the same time. To my dear wife Madam Chu, treat this letter like my person. Chu Lian's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she calmed down and continued reading. There were actually 8 whole sheets of paper in this very thick letter. Although senior servant Liu couldn't see what was written on the papers, she could see that each sheet was covered in writing. Her eyes curved upwards in a smile. It looked like third young master had a lot to say to third young madam. Those servants outside were all blind. How dare they say that third young master and his wife weren't on good terms with each other? How could they say that third young master had gone to join the army at the northern border because he wasn't happy with this marriage that the old matriarch had gotten for him? Look at this thick stack of papers. If those people dared to continue speaking nonsense like that, she was going to smack them in the face with this letter. He Sanlang had written a lot in this letter. It took Chu Lian 15 whole minutes to finish reading it all. When she lifted her gaze from the paper, she was met with senior servant Liu's bright, sparkling eyes. The old servant practically had the words "tell me what he wrote" written on her forehead. Chu Lian felt a little embarrassed and very put on the spot. She didn't know what to tell senior servant Liu. Did she really have to tell senior servant Liu that He Sanlang had questioned why she had sent him an envelope full of blank papers? That he had said she didn't deserve to be his wife since she hadn't put in full care and consideration for him? He had also complained that she hadn't sent anything for him in the previous package. Her husband was fighting hard in the far-off northern border, yet she hadn't even sent him proper clothes and shoes or socks. Furthermore, she hadn't sent any of the beef jerky and grape wine that she had sent the last time. He Sanlang even added on that she shouldn't think too highly of herself even though she was already an honored lady personally named by the emperor. An honored lady was just a 5th-ranked title. If she wanted a greater noble rank in the future, she would still have to depend on him, her useless husband. When Chu Lian had first started reading, she did get a little angry at his words. However, as she continued reading on, she couldn't help but find it funny instead. When she looked carefully at what he wrote again, why did it seem like his bold brushstrokes carried a sour trace to them? Chu Lian rolled her eyes. This crazy husband of hers, He Sanlang, was being a hypocrite. Right after they had gotten married, he had completely changed into a different person and left her all alone in the estate without any warning at all. Now he suddenly turned around and was trying to dictate her life. What gave him that right? Just look at what this guy had written at the end of his letter. Madam Chu, as my wife, What are you doing cooking for other people all day? Remember what a wife is supposed to do. Could she just translate these words into, "You're not allowed to cook for anyone else but me, otherwise I'm going to get mad"? Chu Lian rolled her eyes and didn't take He Changdi's words to heart at all. He Sanlang was far off at the northern border. How was he going to do anything to her from that distance? However, she hadn't expected that He Sanlang would get promoted to captain this quickly. She actually admired him for his ability due to this. It wasn't easy to rise through the ranks in the army, especially during peacetime and in such a short amount of time, too. Not only that, but Great General Qian was known to be a strict commander as well. It looked like the hints she had drawn for He Sanlang the last time had come into play. Chu Lian was still in the dark about her unintentional involvement in He Changdi's promotion. Chu Lian coughed awkwardly before reporting to senior servant Liu, "My husband wrote that is already a captain of the infantry in the Northern Border Army. He has a 6th-ranked military title now." "Aya, that's great news. This old servant has to report this to the matriarch immediately." After saying so, senior servant Liu quickly got up and rushed all the way back to Qingxi Hall with the people she had brought with her. Chu Lian helplessly wiped away her sweat. At least she had somehow gotten senior servant Liu out of here. Otherwise, she really didn't know how she was going to explain the rest of the letter to the wise senior servant. However, it seemed like senior servant Liu hadn't been acting in her reaction just now. Hadn't He Sanlang reported his promotion in his letter to grandmother? But why? Could it be that he was aiming much higher and thought that a small captain rank wasn't worth mentioning? Then why had he talked about it in his letter to her? Furthermore, he had even emphasized his newly gotten rank to her. Chu Lian thought hard and finally arrived at a possible conclusion. Could her honored lady title have aggravated him somehow? Was He Sanlang trying to show off to her that he had a bright future ahead as well? That any future noble titles of hers would be up to him to bestow on her? Chu Lian shook her head and smiled. This sudden thought was just too silly. He Sanlang clearly didn't like her at all, judging by how he had treated her after marriage. If he could divorce her without any reason at all, he probably wouldn't even take a minute to make a decision. How could a man who treated her like that suddenly think of her in that way? The corners of her lips tugged downwards. She wasn't supposed to think about all this. It was better to just be a layabouts who didn't need to care about annoying things like this. Xian was watching her master's expression change with an uneasy heart. She didn't know what third young madam was thinking about. Chapter 255. My dear wife Madam Chu, treat this letter like my person, too. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. The day after tomorrow was Countess Jingen's birthday. Her birthday landed right after the autumn examinations ended, so the results would likely be posted on that day, as well. All these important events had been squeezed together for some reason. However, since House Jingen was a military official family and none of their family members had taken part in the examinations, they wouldn't need to bother with the results. They would most likely hear about the top 3 scholars later and discuss it for a moment before forgetting about it. However, Chu Lian knew that the top scholar for the autumn examinations was going to be Xiaobo Jian, the original male lead of the story. That scheming, ambitious man was going to use this result to transform himself and secure a seat at court. As much as Chu Lian didn't want to see that happen, she had no way to stop it either. There was a limit to her ability, and Xiaobo Jian had a mysterious power backing him. She hadn't finished reading the book. Up to where she had stopped, the author had only mentioned that Xiaobo Jian had a powerful force backing him, but hadn't revealed more details about it. As her thoughts led up to here, Chu Lian wanted to smash her bed out of regret and frustration. Why hadn't she read the ending before starting the book? Her half-baked knowledge of the events of the book was now making her uneasy. She didn't know what Xiaobo Jian was going to do later on. However, since she didn't know what was going to happen, she could only take it one step at a time. At least she still had a general understanding of the near future, so she didn't have to worry too much for now. The day before Countess Jingen's birthday. It was coming close to winter in the capital. Cold winds blew past like knives gliding across people's cheeks. The north wind was blowing in the courtyard, But the bedroom in Qingxi Hall was as warm as spring thanks to the underground heating. By this time, Matriarch he had already woken up and was in the midst of having breakfast. While drinking some warm tea, she chatted with senior servant Liu and Muxiang. Senior servant Liu was squatting down and massaging Matriarch his legs. Matriarch, you should have seen how sweet third young master and third young madam are with each other. Third young master wrote a letter this thick for third young madam. She even spread her thumb and index finger wide to illustrate her point. This old servant was just sitting next to third young madam and watching her read the letter. Third young madam read through that letter at least 7 times over. Oh my, this Sanlang. He's finally realizing how good his wife is after leaving for the north. That's fine, the two of them are still young. Once Sanlang remembers this suffering, the two of them will be even closer after he comes back. Matriarch he had still been a little unwell over the past few days. However, after receiving a letter from her youngest grandson yesterday, her spirit had returned, along with her smiles. She looked both cheerful and energetic today, and her pallor seemed to have improved. Senior servant Liu knew that Matriarch he was the most worried about He Changdi out of all her grandsons, so she took the chance to try to cheer Matriarch he up with some news. What else could make Matriarch he happy other than good news about the youngest couple of their family? When Madame Zhu arrived at the entrance of the bedroom with her daughters in hand, she heard the sounds of laughter from within. Madame Zhu frowned. In this month, she had actually slimmed down quite a bit. Her originally slightly plump cheeks were now sunken in on her face, making her look much older than she actually was. She gritted her teeth with a spark of unhappiness in her eyes. Her mother-in-law's birthday was almost here and she was the one who had to take care of all the matters related to it as the lady in charge of the household. She was so busy that she barely had any time to rest. It was already bad enough that the matriarch wasn't helping her, but look at what was happening in her courtyard. They were laughing so loudly, it was like they had forgotten their manners. Little Anne and little Lin trembled in their mother's grip. Their expressions seemed a little strained, as if they could sense their mother's unhappiness. The maidservant watching the door helped Madame Zhu lift the curtains covering the entrance and Madame Zhu led her 2 little ones into the warm room. When they caught sight of the affable matriarch Little Anne and little Lin immediately broke free from their mother's hands and ran towards the matriarch. Matriarch he chuckled and lifted the 2 children to sit on either side of her. She then patted their heads. Little Anne and little Lin have come. Was it cold outside? Little Anne tugged at her little sister's hand and secretly glanced at Madame Zhu before shaking her head obediently. Little Anne isn't cold at all. Little Anne wanted to come and see great-grandmother earlier. Hey, my little Anne's the best. Matriarch he quickly carried the 6-year-old little Anne and hugged her. Since the matriarch's health had just recovered, senior servant Liu was afraid that the weight of little Anne might hurt the matriarch's body. She quickly shot a look at the 2 nursemaids standing by and the 2 nursemaids hurried forward to carry the children away to play. It was only after Madame Zhu had finished watching matriarch he bond with her 2 children that she stepped forward to greet the matriarch. Granddaughter-in-law greets grandmother. Matriarch he waved away the formality and instructed her granddaughter-in-law to take a seat. It's getting colder outside now. Little Anne and little Lin are still young and they're just little girls. Their bodies are frail, so you don't have to bring them to greet me every day. Let the 2 children sleep a little more. These words were just matriarch his way of caring for her great-granddaughters, but they seemed to hold a different meaning in Madame Zhu's mind. Her expression stiffened and she replied, "That wouldn't be good, grandmother. Although they're young, they're still your legitimate great-granddaughters. Greeting you in the morning is part of their duties." Chapter 256, Targeting Guilin Restaurant, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Matriarch he stiffened imperceptibly and turned towards Darlang's wife, who was sitting not too far away with her head down. Even though they met every day, why did she have the feeling that Darlang's wife had changed a lot recently? How could matriarch he have missed that hidden meaning in Madame Zhu's words? Darlang's wife was afraid that the 2 little ones had lost favor with her and was trying to make sure that she wouldn't forget about the existence of the 2 young girls. Unfortunately, Madame Zhu hadn't understood her kind intentions at all. Her heart was only filled with thoughts of fighting for favor. Matriarch, his earlier good mood completely dissipated. Do as you like. Make sure that the servants keep a watch on the girl's health. The weather outside is so cold now, so make sure they put on more layers and bring a hand warmer with them when going out. Granddaughter-in-law understands. Matriarch, he picked up her teacup and took a sip before she said, "It's your mother's birthday tomorrow. How are the preparations going?" "Rest assured, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law has already ordered the servants to prepare everything. There won't be any accidents tomorrow. This old woman is already getting on in age and your mother's health still isn't what it was. It's been hard on you all these years." Madame Zhu almost cried out upon hearing these words of praise from Matriarch He. Wasn't it so? She was the only one managing this huge estate. How could it possibly be easy? She had to get up early in the morning before the sun rose and listen to the daily reports from all the stewards of the estate, arrange for servants where needed, and even had to mind the relationships between the people in the estate. It could be said that this great Jing'an estate wouldn't be able to function without her. Madame Zhu felt even more aggrieved upon thinking about all this and sunk even further into her self-pity. Tears leaked out of her eyes, already beyond her control. As long as grandmother understands granddaughter-in-law's hardships, then this bit of labor is nothing to granddaughter-in-law. All right, stop crying, don't spoil your eyes by crying too much. If you have any hardships, you can tell grandmother directly. Madame Zhu was still choked up with tears as she looked up at Matriarch He with wet eyes. Grandmother, since you asked, granddaughter-in-law won't keep it from you anymore. Granddaughter-in-law does have a matter to discuss with grandmother. Matriarch He was slightly stunned. She hadn't expected that Madame Zhu would really take her up on her offer. What is it? Just say it out directly. There's nothing you have to hide from me. Madame Zhu hesitated before finally gathering the courage to speak. Grandmother, mother's medical expenses. I'm afraid our estate's public accounts can no longer afford them. A single month of Countess Jing'an's medicine cost at least 1,000 taels. The monthly income for House Jing'an's public accounts was merely 1,000 to 2,000 taels. Furthermore, Madame Zhu wasn't good at business management, and the managers of the stores and properties they had were appropriating funds for themselves. It was getting harder and harder to keep this noble estate afloat. Countess Jing'an had previously paid for her own medicine, and her expenses had only shifted to the shared accounts just 2 months ago. After less than 3 months, the estate's funds were already dwindling. Matriarch He hadn't expected that their estate's funds would be exhausted so quickly. Her brows drew together in a frown and she was about to speak when a maidservant announced the arrival of third young madam. Even though the matriarch had been interrupted, she wasn't angry at all. Instead, her expression turned cheerful. Quick, invite Sanlang's wife in. It's cold outside. The thick curtains covering the entrance of the heated room were pulled aside by the maidservant standing outside, and Chu Lian crouched slightly to enter the room. Since Chu Lian's noble title had been bestowed by the Chengping Emperor himself, she could be counted as part of the imperial family. Thus, the palace's Department of Textiles had sent Chu Lian 2 outfits when they prepared winter clothing for the imperial family. There was a lovely light vermilion court dress and a simpler teal dress with auspicious pictures embroidered over it. There were 12 pictures of flowers embroidered on each dress, and the design was both complicated and beautiful at the same time. This standard of craftsmanship was as expected from the department in charge of clothing the imperial family. Today, Chu Lian was wearing that bluish-green dress with a flared skirt. Her slender hands were stuffed into a snow-white sleeve made of rabbit fur. She only wore a single white jade hairpin on her head, and the rest of her black hair was left cascading down her back with some strands resting on the fluffy white fur collar of her dress. She looked like a cute, obedient little bunny in this get-up. If not for the fact that her hair was done up in a married madam's hairstyle, one might think that she was a young noble maiden who had just come of age. Granddaughter-in-law has come to greet grandmother, Chu Lian cheerfully called out as she entered the room. Matriarch He felt happy just seeing Chu Lian's smooth as porcelain, doll-like face with a smile. What are you doing coming here so early on such a cold day? Come, sit next to grandmother. Chu Lian bobbed towards Madame Zhu before sitting next to Matriarch He. The matriarch ordered senior servant Liu to give Chu Lian a cup of warm honey water. She knew her little granddaughter-in-law didn't like to drink sencha, unlike most people. Madame Zhu watched coldly as matriarch he unconsciously showed loving care and consideration for Chu Lian. The hands under her sleeves curled into fists. Madame Zhu suppressed her jealousy and waited until Chu Lian had been given a warm cup of honey water. Only then did she say, "Grandmother, about that matter that granddaughter-in-law mentioned earlier." Reminded of the pressing problem at hand by Madame Zhu, matriarch his expression turned serious. "It was my fault for not considering this matter more carefully. However, I seem to remember that we should have at least 3,000 taels of income from the shopfronts in our estate's accounts. 3,000 taels were more than enough to sustain the estate's monthly expenses, even after taking away Countess Jingen's medicine fees." Madame Zhu's lips parted, but she hesitated to speak. Finally, she used her remaining courage to say, "Grandmother, that was the situation 5 years ago. It can't be compared to the situation now." Madame Zhu suddenly shot a glance in Chu Lian's direction. When she saw that her sister-in-law had her head lowered and was drinking some honey water instead, a spark of dissatisfaction flashed through her heart. Granddaughter-in-law doesn't have a single store in hand that can compare to third sister-in-law's Guilin restaurant. Chapter 257, Targeting Guilin Restaurant, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian wasn't in charge of managing the estate and had no desire to take up the responsibility, either. She had just been drinking her water and doing her best to become one with the background. Why had this eldest sister-in-law of hers suddenly shifted the topic to her instead? Chu Lian's hands froze while in the midst of holding up her cup. However, she knew it wasn't a good time to speak and remained silent. Matriarch his brows furrowed together. How could the estate's income have shrunken so fast? When given the rights to manage the properties of their noble estates, the madams of other estates would likely develop the properties in their hands further and bring in more income. However, look at Dalang's wife. Not only had their businesses stagnated, but their income had even shrunk by half. How was she managing the estate's properties? After Madame Zhu spoke, she did feel a little guilty. She had appropriated some funds to plump up her dowry and house Ding Yuan's second branch after becoming the lady in charge of the estate. Otherwise, the estate's income couldn't have declined so fast. In the beginning, Guilin Restaurant hadn't been Chu Lian's property, rather, it had been part of the matriarch's dowry. Madame Zhu only saw the vast profits that Guilin Restaurant was bringing in now, but had never thought of the reason, or person, behind Guilin Restaurant's success. If not for Chu Lian, then Guilin Restaurant would still be hidden away in the Old West Market and making a loss. After hearing Madame Zhu's words, matriarch he was stunned for a moment. When she recovered from her daze, she said, "Dalang's wife, what are you thinking about now?" Madame Zhu took a deep breath and pinched herself under her sleeves. She gathered up her courage to say, "After all this time, granddaughter-in-law has finally seen that third sister-in-law has a good hand at managing businesses. We're all House Jingen's granddaughters-in-law, so third sister-in-law should put some responsibility on her shoulders, too. Since third sister-in-law has the capability, why don't we move Guilin Restaurant into our estate's public accounts? If grandmother thinks that this is doing a disservice to third sister-in-law, I can move out some other properties from the public accounts as compensation. Since third sister-in-law is so skilled, I'm sure those properties can become the next Guilin Restaurant in less than 2 months." Once Madame Zhu finished speaking, it was not only Chu Lian, but even matriarch he and senior servant Liu who were shocked. A glint flashed through Chu Lian's wide almond-shaped eyes. Chu Lian inwardly sneered. She hadn't expected that Madame Zhu would try to pull such a trick on her here. It seemed like she had set her sights on Guilin Restaurant and was already green-eyed with envy. What a pity that matriarch he had already handed over the deeds and documents for Guilin Restaurant to her a few days ago. Guilin Restaurant was now completely hers. It was useless for Madame Zhu to ask for it from matriarch he. If she wanted Guilin Restaurant, Madame Zhu should be pleading her for it instead. Chu Lian lowered her gaze and continued her silence with a calm expression, as if Madame Zhu's words had nothing to do with her, as if Madame Zhu wasn't trying to steal the property in her hands right in front of matriarch he. Matriarch He and senior servant Liu turned to look at Chu Lian at the same time. The furrow between Matriarch His brows grew even deeper. Darlang's wife, what are you saying? I've already told you that I've given Guilin restaurant to Liana. You were present then and you didn't say anything. Why are you trying to ask for it back now? This isn't appropriate. Furthermore, I've already given Liana the deed to Guilin restaurant. Madame Zhu's expression changed abruptly. Grandmother, if we have this Guilin restaurant in the estate's public accounts, we won't have to worry about mother's medicine fees any longer. What's more, third sister-in-law is capable in this respect. Alright, you don't have to say any more. I've already made my decision. Since you said that the public funds can no longer accommodate your mother's monthly medical expenses, then I'll pay for half of it from my own private funds. The remaining half will be paid for with the public funds. This wasn't the result that Madame Zhu wanted. What she wanted was Chu Lian's Guilin restaurant. That was the real golden goose. If she managed to get it in hand, that meant that she would own all of Guilin restaurant's secret recipes. By then, she could even open up 10 restaurants like Guilin if she wanted to. Wouldn't she be rolling in riches then? Just as Madame Zhu was getting antsy and trying to come up with her next plan, Chu Lian suddenly spoke up. I didn't know that eldest sister-in-law and grandmother were worried over this matter. Grandmother, let granddaughter-in-law pay for mother's medicine expenses instead. Granddaughter-in-law's Guilin restaurant has indeed earned quite a sum last month. Since granddaughter-in-law has the ability to do so, granddaughter-in-law should support the estate in this manner. It's also mother's medicine expenses we're talking about here. Since Sanlang isn't around, this is all granddaughter-in-law can do for the estate. Granddaughter-in-law hopes that grandmother and eldest sister-in-law will accept this small effort. Chu Lian had been intending to act as a silent prop in the background and drink her favorite honey water while listening to grandmother and eldest sister-in-law chat about family matters. However, since Madame Zhu was trying to plot against her, she wouldn't simply lie back and take it. She wasn't someone to be bullied. She hadn't really wanted to say something like this at first, but the situation had forced her hand. Bringing up the matter of Countess Jingen's medicine fees in front of Matriarch, he was already reflecting rather badly upon Madame Zhu. However, later on, without offering to pay for her mother-in-law's medicine herself, she had even tried to snatch away Guilin restaurant, her sister-in-law's only property. Those high-sounding words she had used to pave the way beforehand were just that, grand yet empty. How could Matriarch He not detect the selfish motives in Madame Zhu's words? Despite that, Chu Lian had readily agreed to this when Madame Zhu was completely unwilling to do so. She was even going to pay for her mother-in-law's expenses. With this comparison, it was easy to tell who was the better person. Madame Zhu had been left completely in the dust. Besides that, Chu Lian was originally a poor miss without much in her dowry, so this comparison stood out even more. Madame Zhu's face turned a different color and shifted through all sorts of expressions. Chapter 258, Birthday 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian's offer was completely out of Matriarch His expectations. She stiffened for a moment in surprise before tears began to gather in the corners of her eyes. She knew roughly how much Guilin restaurant earned in a month. Manager Qin had previously been one of her servants, after all. She also knew that Darlang's wife had brought up that idea purely out of jealousy. In order for their family to stand on stable feet, the inner court had to be at peace or in balance. The matriarch was gratified that Chu Lian was able to make such an offer for the greater good. At the same time, she lamented how much Madame Zhu had changed. In the end, she made the final decision. Sanlang's wife, since you have the heart to do so, you'll be the one to pay for your mother's medicine fees from now on. However, only do so within your own capability and don't push yourself too hard. No matter what happens to you afterwards, you still have this old woman here to support you. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes turned upwards in a smile. Granddaughter-in-law understands. I won't be too shy to ask for help from grandmother. Matriarch He dwelled in thought for a moment before turning to Madame Zhu and telling her, Darlang's wife, this old woman did not expect the family's shared properties to have declined to this state. The blame for this can't be placed on your shoulders, since you didn't have a capable steward to help you manage these properties. I gave Sanlang's wife a manager before, so I'll send you one as well. He'll help you with managing the estate's properties. Madame Zhu looked up in shock right after Matriarch he finished speaking. Her lips trembled and parted as the urge to reject this arrangement flooded her being. However, when she met Matriarch his sharp old eyes, any hope of struggling faded away. It seemed like Matriarch he had already detected those small tricks she had pulled with the estate's properties beforehand, but the Matriarch hadn't bothered to stop it due to her trust in her. Now that she was starting to target the third branch with her schemes, Matriarch he naturally wouldn't continue letting her greed run free. Now that Matriarch he had placed a manager by her side with a completely upright reason, she probably wouldn't be able to continue appropriating funds in secret. Madame Zhu was filled with regret. Not only had she failed to steal Guilin Restaurant, but she had even lost her source of income to boot. When Matriarch he saw that Madame Zhu was choosing to remain silent and was simply looking downwards at the floor, the Matriarch frowned and raised her voice with an unhappy tone. Darlang's wife, did you hear me? Madame Zhu's body shook once. Matriarch his rage showed clearly through her voice. Granddaughter-in-law he heard you. Matriarch he had already been feeling unwell these past 2 days. After facing such a huge problem in the morning thanks to Madame Zhu, her head was starting to ache. All right, since there's nothing else to discuss, all of you should return. Bring little Anne and little Lin back with you too. Madame Zhu was currently feeling very low, so she left quickly with her 2 daughters. Chu Lian was 1 step behind her. Just as she was about to step out of Qingxi Hall's entrance, someone with a clear voice called out from behind. Third young madam, please wait. Chu Lian paused and turned back to look, only to see Matriarch his handmaid Mu Xiang and a few maidservants carrying some exquisite wood boxes. Mu Xiang hurried over in 2 strides. Third young madam, the weather has turned cold, so the Matriarch has sent this servant over to escort you to Songtao Court. Thus, with Mu Xiang supporting her arm on one side and chatting to her, Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court. Following that, Mu Xiang instructed the maidservants behind her to place the brocade-lined boxes on the parlor's table. These are some rewards that the Empress Dowager bestowed upon the Matriarch. There's a handsome white fox fur coat within. It's quite a rare treasure due to its purity. The Matriarch said that a white fur coat like this wouldn't suit her at her age, but it will fit third young madam perfectly. There are also a few brand new exquisite ruby and sapphire accessories. The Matriarch ordered this servant to bring these over to third young madam as well because they'll go along perfectly with the outfits the palace sent over for you. Chu Lian accepted the gifts and had senior servant Zhong send Mu Xiang off. She returned to her own little study, knowing very well that these gifts were Matriarch his way of compensating her. She had taken a look at that white fox coat earlier. It was brand new and hadn't even been worn, so it was indeed a rather expensive gift. If not for that ruckus today, this fox coat would most likely have been given to that sister-in-law of hers, Madame Zhu. Of course, the reason Chu Lian knew this was because she had read about it in the story before. However, due to her arrival, she had changed some of the events. Just as Chu Lian was about to sink into her thoughts, Wen Lan came in to pass a message. Third young madam, Manager Qin has come over. He's waiting in the parlor outside. Chu Lian stood up to meet Manager Qin. In less than 15 minutes, they were done with the meeting and Manager Qin left. Senior servant Gui had been standing behind Chu Lian during the meeting. She had a bewildered expression on her face as she asked, "Third young madam, what is this about?" Just now, she had watched as Chu Lian gave Manager Qin a letter and listed out 3 questions. Manager Qin was to put up these 3 questions at the entrance of Guilin Restaurant with a notice to announce that anyone who could answer all 3 questions correctly would get a free meal at Guilin Restaurant. Chu Lian smiled mysteriously. "Don't worry, Momo. It's not anything bad. It'll be a surprise." Senior servant Gui was even more confused. She couldn't even start to guess at what her master was trying to do now. Nonetheless, with Chu Lian's guarantee, senior servant Gui felt reassured. Chapter 259, Birthday, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volare Novels. Please read from the original source. In the afternoon, someone from the outer court came to ask Chu Lian for her reply to He Changdi's letter. The manservant who had come was senior servant Liu's son, who was working in the outer court. Actually, Chu Lian had already prepared the letter and the accompanying package yesterday. If not for the huge package that third young madam's maidservants were carrying, the manservant would have already tried to hint at how the letter seemed to be a little too thin. When he held it in his hands, it was almost as light as a feather. Looking at how thin it was, there was most likely only a single sheet of paper inside. Didn't third young madam have any sweet nothings to say to third young master? Third young master's letter had been so much thicker. As the manservant carried the package on his back and left Songtao Court, his lips were pressed together tightly. This letter was way too thin. How was he going to report this to his mother later? Wasn't third young madam way too relaxed? Wasn't she worried that third young master would fall for other women while he was away? Even though she had been given the chance, she hadn't tried to bond more with her husband. Third young madam was still too young. If this manservant were to find out how He Sanlang had been passing his days at the northern border, he probably wouldn't be thinking like that. Once House Jingen's letters and packages had been sent to Prince Jin, they still had to be brought to the northern border through Prince Jin's connections before they could reach He Sanlang's hands. In Prince Jin's study, he was currently pacing about in the room with his hands behind his back. His uncommon azure eyes were shining under the light of the candles illuminating the space. After a short moment's wait, the sound of footsteps could be heard from outside the study. When the footsteps stopped, a rough voice called out, "This subordinate greets Prince Jin. Enter." A man carrying a sword at his waist, dressed in a black robe that flared widely at the ends, entered the room. He walked straight up to Prince Jin's side. "Have you carried out the tasks that this prince has entrusted to you?" The square-faced man tensed and knelt down on one knee next to Prince Jin. "This subordinate is useless. This subordinate hasn't found the person that your highness is searching for." Prince Jin sighed and walked over to his desk. He took a seat and picked up the small brush that had already been dipped in ink. Then, he set the brush to paper with vigorous and lively movements. After a few moments, he lifted his brush and let the paper dry before inserting it into an envelope. He placed the letter into the package from House Jingen and stood up before giving orders to the man in black. "Send this to the Eagle team. They'll know what to do. As for the other matter this prince has entrusted to you, continue investigating. You must find that person as soon as you can." After the black-robed man left with the letter and package, Prince Jin sat back down behind his desk with his brows drawn together. Even though He Changdi was one of his most trusted brothers, he still found it hard to believe what He Changdi had written in his letter. Countess Jingen had been ill for more than 20 years. Could that wandering traveler called Miao really treat her sickness? Of course, Prince Jin didn't know that it was this great Dr. Miao who had been the one to treat the Chengping Emperor when he had been afflicted with an incurable illness in He Changdi's past life. Xiaobo Jian had been the one to recommend this doctor to treat the emperor, extending the emperor's life for 5 more years. Later on, when Count Jingen had met this great Dr. Miao, he had described his by then deceased wife's symptoms to this doctor. Great Dr. Miao had then personally declared that Countess Jingen's illness could be cured completely. After treatment, her body would simply be a little weaker than most. Back then, when the newly returned Count Jingen had learned of this news, he had locked himself in his study for 3 whole days and nights. It was also due to this abnormal action from Count Jingen that the He family had all learned that Countess Jingen's illness could have been treated. They simply hadn't been able to meet the right doctor at the right time. The 10th of October was Countess Jingen's 45th birthday. Although it didn't mark the end of another decade of life, it was about halfway. Additionally, Countess Jingen's health had always been rather poor. Her situation had also been getting worse in the recent months, perhaps due to the lower quality of medicinal herbs or some other reason. These few days, she hadn't been able to get up from bed at all. Matriarch he was extremely worried. Her son and his wife were very close. However, her son was currently guarding the border at Mingju. If anything were to happen to his wife, he wouldn't even be able to meet her one last time. What were they going to do in that case? What's more, it wasn't just Count Jingen who was far away from the estate. There was also that little rebel Sanlang out there. Matriarch, he wanted to use Countess Jingen's birthday as a chance to celebrate and cheer her up a little. However, she didn't send out many invites to the celebration. She only invited the noble madams and ladies that their house was closer to. She also sent a letter to her second grandson, He Chungjue, who was still serving in the left military guards, asking him to return home that day for a meal. He Chungjue normally stayed away from home out of fear that his senior family members would try to force him to marry. Thus, he usually stayed in the left military guard barracks even on rest days. However, this time, it was his mother's birthday. Of course, he wouldn't be able to avoid returning home. He switched shifts with one of his comrades and rushed home early on the day itself with his mother's birthday present. Chu Lian had already prepared her present much earlier. It was a pearl headdress that she had personally designed and specially requested one of Jinsha Pavilion's master craftsmen to make. Pearls were good for the health and suited Countess Jingen more than those blinding precious stones. Furthermore, the headdress design that Chu Lian had come up with was completely new to the Great Wu dynasty. Fresh and elegant, they were most suited for a 45-year-old noble madam to wear. Royal Princess Duanjia was coming to the celebration today too. They had agreed on it beforehand. If she hadn't been afraid to steal the spotlight at Countess Jingen's birthday banquet, Princess Wei would have also liked to come. Early in the morning, Royal Princess Duanjia was escorted to House Jingen's entrance by her estate's guards. Chu Liu had said that she would personally cook breakfast for her if she arrived early. Even though Royal Princess Duanjia knew that Chu Liu was a foodie, she hadn't actually seen her cook with her own eyes yet. Royal Princess Duanjia had been waiting forever for this day. Thus, when getting off her carriage, she was a little rash in her actions. She tried to jump off the carriage before it had even come to a complete stop. In the next instant, all she could hear was the bellow of a horse as the world turned into a flurry of motion. TL note: the flared robe that the man in black is wearing is literally called the flying fish robe and looks like this: flying fish robe. Chapter 260, First Place, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. He Erlang innocently rode his handsome horse on his way back to the estate without any inkling of what was about to happen to him. After getting scolded by his superior yesterday, he then had to face a messenger sent by his grandmother to harry him into returning home for his mother's birthday. He had come out from his barracks on horseback early this morning with his heart filled with frustration. Thus, he had let his horse sprint all the way to the entrance of the estate before thinking to pull in the reins, only to see a low-key luxuriously decorated horse carriage come speeding over recklessly. Before the carriage even stopped, someone jumped out from the carriage and started on a collision course with his horse's belly. He Erlang was pretty skilled in martial arts. With a twist of his waist, he reached out with his muscled arms and grabbed hold of the person about to fall out of the carriage. However, in order to do so, he had to kick off on his horse's side. The horse began to cry out from the immense pain it was feeling. It reared up and tried to shake He Erlang off its back. He Erlang's arms were wrapped around Royal Princess Duanjia. Upon realizing that he was about to fall off his horse, he could only twist his body again and roll off from the horse's back himself. However, he wasn't able to adjust his center of gravity properly and ended up in a position where he was going to fall onto Royal Princess Duanjia. He Erlang suddenly realized that he was holding a fragile young lady in his arms. If he really fell right on top of her with his huge frame, wouldn't she be squashed flat? After that thought flashed through his mind, He Erlang had already made his decision. He shifted his body slightly and let his broad back face the carriage. His toned arms tensed and pulled Royal Princess Duanjia into his embrace. Just as Royal Princess Duanjia was about to scream from fright, she heard the muffled thud of a body slamming against the side of the carriage. Finally, it was He Erlang's broad back that hit the ground first. Royal Princess Duanjia was protected in his embrace, so all she suffered was some messy hair and disheveled clothing. He Erlang felt a twinge of pain in his back, but his only reaction was a slightly furrowed brow. He quickly loosened the hold of his arms and asked in his deep and slightly husky voice, "Miss, are you all right? Have you been hurt?" It wasn't until she heard He Erlang's caring words that Royal Princess Duanjia finally returned to her senses. She was still slightly dazed and completely forgot how to move, or even how to speak. She simply stared at the strong-looking man under her blankly. Your Highness, are you all right? Without waiting for Royal Princess Duanjia to finish regaining her wits, her servants had all come running over to her with pale faces. When one of her handmaids saw that the princess was still dazed and lying on top of a man's body, all the remaining color drained from her face. She quickly went over to help Royal Princess Duanjia up. Your Highness, have you been hurt anywhere? Royal Princess Duanjia subconsciously shook her head in reply. She allowed one of her handmaids, Jinxiu, to straighten out her disheveled clothes with the help of another handmaid while she turned to look at the man who had just saved her. After hearing how the group of servants had addressed the girl he had just saved, He Chongjue was also slightly surprised. He hadn't expected that the person he had just saved would turn out to be a royal princess. When Royal Princess Duanjia had been helped up by those servants, He Chongjue had also gotten up onto his feet and dusted off his sleeves. His height wasn't noticeable while he was still lying on the ground. However, the moment he stood up, his head seemed to be a whole length higher than the ladies around him. He Chongjue looked both tall and strong, and the uniform of the left military guards only emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist. His skin was slightly tanned, and although his features weren't as fine as He Changdi's, he gave off a firm and resolute aura. Just his mere presence was reassuring to the people around him. When He Chongjue noticed Royal Princess Duanjia looking up at him, he shifted his gaze away and bowed towards her. He apologized and said, "My name is He Chongjue of the left military guards. This humble one was terribly impolite towards your highness just now, but this humble one was forced to do so due to the circumstances. Please forgive this humble one, your highness." Royal Princess Duanjia kept staring at him silently. However, in her heart, she was now clear on He Chongjue's identity. When she saw that this tall, strong man had to bend down and lower his head to her, that he didn't even dare to look at her, it was odd the princess didn't feel the slightest bit inclined to blame He Chongjue for the incident. Instead, the mischievous urge to keep watching his awkwardness rose up in her mind. When He Chongjue didn't hear any response from the princess before him for a long while, he looked up a little and glanced at Royal Princess Duanjia. However, when he caught sight of the sly look in her eyes, He Chongjue stiffened and felt even more uneasy. Jinxiu was getting more and more antsy just watching this. It wasn't good for them to continue standing like this in front of the Jing'an estate's main entrance. Today was Countess Jing'an's birthday, so there were definitely going to be more guests coming later on. Royal Princess Duanjia hid away the emotions in her eyes and purposely raised her chin to say, "Then this princess will forgive you just this once for your offense. There will be no next time." After finally getting a response from the princess, He Chongjue inwardly heaved a sigh of relief. "Many thanks, your highness." Royal Princess Duanjia soon entered the Jing'an estate with her servants supporting her on either side and He Chongjue following behind with some distance between them. Royal Princess Duanjia had thought that he would escort her to the parlor in the outer court at first, but He Erlang quickly turned and left on a different path after they entered the Jing'an estate. When she turned around, all she caught was his tall figure hurriedly leaving. Royal Princess Duanjia couldn't help but bite her lip in frustration. Following that, she went to Songtao Court to look for Chu Lian. Chapter 261, First Place, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian knew that Royal Princess Duanjia was going to come early today, so she was in the middle of cooking some chicken porridge for the princess. She ordered Xian to make more crystal buns since Royal Princess Duanjia liked them, and then retreated from the kitchen back to her bedroom to change into another outfit. Right after she finished changing, she heard some noise from Songtao Court's entrance. Royal Princess Duanjia immediately told Chu Lian all about what had happened to her just now, giving Chu Lian a huge fright. How lucky that second brother had come back to the estate at the right time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been good if Royal Princess Duanjia had really fallen. She instructed Wenqing and Wenlan to bring Royal Princess Duanjia to another room to wash up a little and change out of her clothes before the two of them sat down to have breakfast. Royal Princess Duanjia pouted. "Chu Liu, I missed the chance to watch you cook for me again." Chu Lian rolled her eyes speechlessly. Princess, isn't it good enough if you get to eat the results of my cooking? Why do you want to watch me cook? Don't tell me that you're trying to learn how to cook yourself. If you want to learn how to cook, it's easy enough. I'll just write out some of my recipes for you and you can get one of your estate's cooks to teach you. Royal Princess Duanjia quickly shook her head. I'm not trying to learn how to cook. That's too troublesome. If I want to eat something good, I'll just come look for you. Anyway, I can come at any time and you'll cook for me regardless, right, Chu Liu? Then why do you want to watch me cook? I'm just curious. I want to see how you made all these delicacies step by step. Chu Lian didn't know what to say at all about Royal Princess Duanjia's strange liking. Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly reached out with her chopsticks and pointed at the crystal buns and crystal dumplings in front of her. Chu Liu, you haven't made these for He Sanlang to eat before, have you? Chu Lian wasn't sure why Royal Princess Duanjia had suddenly asked such a question, but she shook her head honestly. Strictly speaking, it seemed like He Changdi had only eaten her wontons and scallion pancakes before. And that beef jerky she had sent. Now that she thought about it, he really hadn't eaten much of her cooking. Ha ha ha, Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly burst out into laughter, even holding onto her stomach. Chu Lian tapped the jade bowl in front of her. Princess, are you going to eat or not? If you're not going to eat this, I'll let the maidservants clear it away. Royal Princess Duanjia quickly covered the bowl full of chicken porridge protectively and shook her head. No, don't clear it. I haven't even eaten enough. Chu Liu, I just suddenly thought that He Sanlang is rather pitiful. Ha ha ha. He actually hasn't tasted such delicious buns before. Chu Lian glanced at Royal Princess Duanjia helplessly. She was clearly reveling in someone else's misfortune. Who would laugh like that if they were pitying others' circumstances? It wasn't until Royal Princess Duanjia had filled up her tummy that she let the maidservants clear away the dishes on the table and ordered 2 cups of honey water. Royal Princess Duanjia held up the white porcelain teacup with both hands. Chu Liu, the rankings for the autumn examinations are already out. Take a guess at who the top 3 are. Chu Lian stiffened. She hadn't expected the rankings to have come out so quickly. When she remembered that Xiao Bojian had been the top scholar for the autumn examinations in the story, her mood turned sour. She half-heartedly replied, "Scholars from the Imperial College?" Royal Princess Duanjia didn't notice Chu Lian's sudden change of mood. She nodded and continued, "That's right. Other than the second-placed scholar, the first and third-placed scholars all came from the Imperial College. The top scholar this time is the Imperial College's Xiao Bojian. Speaking of which, you should know of him. He's one of your grandfather's pupils and has even been living in the Ying estate." Chu Lian completely missed whatever Royal Princess Duanjia said after she heard that Xiao Bojian had gotten the first place in the examinations. Her heart seemed to quiver as she thought about the events in the later part of the book. As optimistic as she was, Chu Lian couldn't help but frown. Chu Liu, what's wrong? Are you listening to me? Chu Lian was dragged back to reality by Royal Princess Duanjia. What did you say, Your Highness? Royal Princess Duanjia cast a measuring gaze towards Chu Lian. Chu Liu, what's happened to you? You seem a little absent-minded. It's nothing. My spirit hasn't been too good these few days, perhaps due to how busy I've been. Royal Princess Duanjia could tell that Chu Lian wasn't willing to talk about it, so she simply repeated the question she had just asked. What kind of gift did you prepare for Countess Jingen? When I arrived at Songtao Court just now, a few of your maidservants were chatting and saying that your eldest sister-in-law's going to give the Countess 100-year-old ginseng. He Sanlang isn't around, so you can't let her beat you. There's nothing to compare. No way, I just don't like that eldest sister-in-law of yours. Look at how fragile and gentle she's acting. You must be getting bullied by her often here. This won't do. I'll send someone back to my estate to bring a 200-year-old red ginseng over. The corner of Xian's eyes twitched as she listened to this conversation and she sighed in her heart. With third young madam's temperament, how could she possibly get bullied? If anyone actually dared to bully her, she would return it eye for eye on the spot. There's no need for that. I've already prepared my gift. After saying so, Chu Lian sent Xian into her room to bring out an accessory case to let Royal Princess Duanjia have a look. This headdress is for Princess Wei. Your Highness, help me bring it back to her. I'll also be giving my mother a pearl headdress, just in a different style and with different materials. However, I personally designed both of these and ordered a master craftsman from Jinsha Pavilion to make them both. Royal Princess Duanjia opened up the case, revealing an elegant pearl headdress within. Its design was novel and exquisite. Even the accessories from the palace couldn't compare to this. She said sourly, Chu Liu, don't tell me that my mother has a higher position in your heart than I do. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She could only bring out another small box. Here, I prepared this for you. It's a pink pearl bracelet, also designed by me. I have a matching bracelet. It was only after seeing the bracelet that Royal Princess Duanjia's mood lifted. She immediately put it on her slender wrist and showed it off to Chu Lian. Actually, there wasn't any special meaning behind Chu Lian's gifts. She only felt that she had to give them something in return, especially since Princess Wei would bestow some rewards to her each time she visited Prince Wei's estate. Princess Wei was her elder too, so it wasn't good for her to keep receiving gifts from her without an appropriate return gift. It was already pretty late to be giving her a return gift at this time. Princess Wei treated her very well. She could even tell that Princess Wei looked at her with the same loving gaze she would look at Royal Princess Duanjia with. TL note, here comes more food porn tilde for the crystal buns. After doing some research, it seems like the stuffing inside varies a lot by region. If someone knows more, feel free to correct me. A Chinese recipe on the Chinese Wikipedia says the stuffing is made with pig stomach fats, while a Teochew recipe says that the stuffing is made up of small diced yellow bean curd, long beans, and Chinese celery and some red peanuts. Crystal buns, rainbow crystal buns. I'm more familiar with these crystal dumplings. They're a type of dim sum also known as har gao, made of minced prawn paste tilde. I had lots of these during my recent vacation in Hong Kong XD. Here's a recipe I found for them. https://redhousespice.com har gao crystal prawn dumplings, cute rabbit crystal dumplings. These are so cute, OMG. Chapter 262, Birthday Gift, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Although Chu Lian didn't know why Princess Wei cared for her so much, she knew that Princess Wei was being genuine. Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia chatted happily together in Songtao Court. When Chu Lian noticed that it was about time, she led Royal Princess Duanjia over to Matriarch his Qingxi Hall. The moment they reached Qingxi Hall's entrance, they could hear the pleasant buzz of women chattering away. Royal Princess Duanjia glanced curiously towards Qingxi Hall before tugging at Chu Lian's sleeve and asking, "It sounds like there are a lot of young ladies inside." A sly glint shone in Chu Lian's eyes. She covered the mischievous smile on her lips and replied, "Royal Princess, didn't you see my second brother today? I'm afraid grandmother's using this chance to help him look for a bride." Ah! He Chungjue was looking for a bride. For some reason, Royal Princess Duanjia's spirits fell upon hearing this piece of news. Chu Lian assumed Royal Princess Duanjia didn't know the context for this, so she continued to explain the current state of the Jing'an household. "Princess, I'm sure you don't know this, but my second brother doesn't come home often. Even grandmother can't do anything about him. However, as a legitimate son of House Jing'an, he can't stay single forever. So grandmother is using mother's birthday banquet as an excuse to invite more noble families over with their eligible daughters." He Chungjue was already 24 this year. At this age, he could be considered an old bachelor in the capital. However, considering House Jing'an's good reputation and noble family status, coupled with He Changjue's looks, character, and position in the Dragon Guards, there were still many families looking to marry their daughters to him, even though he was slightly older than the usual age of a bachelor. Thus, there were quite a few noble madams and ladies in attendance today. The sweet and charming ladies here were all waiting for the chance to meet He Erlang later on when it was time to wish Countess Jing'an a happy birthday. Royal Princess Duanjia had actually heard some rumors about the He family's second son before. However, they had still been complete strangers at that time, so she had just treated them as some funny stories to listen to. Now that Chu Lian was talking about it to her directly, there was a strange feeling in her heart. Was he Erlang really going to choose a wife? Chu Lian pulled Royal Princess Duanjia along with her into the courtyard and headed towards the heated room. Chu Lian had gotten the chance to marry into House Jing'an thanks to that peculiar reputation the ladies of House Ying had. Later on, she had made a name for herself at House Dingyuan. Almost right after that, the emperor had personally given her the title Honored Lady Genie, and then she had opened a restaurant that seemed to be growing more and more popular each day. Any one of these events would be enough to fuel the capital's gossip mills for a while. However, they were all centered around the same person and had happened one after another. The group of noble madams and ladies gathered around Matriarch He were eagerly waiting to meet the honored Lady Genie, who had somehow gone from a nobody to the talk of the town right after marrying into House Jing'an. This lady had been an insignificant young lady from a third-rate noble house before. How had she suddenly turned into such a bright personage that no one was able to ignore? When Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia entered the heated room, everyone's gazes landed on the two of them at the same time. The two young ladies had very similar figures, the only differences were in their clothing and accessories. Their facial features even carried the same sense of purity and beauty. If not for the very different hairstyles and clothing the two were wearing, this group of ladies might not have been able to tell which one was Royal Princess Duanjia and which one was House Jing'an's third young madam. When they had their first look at Chu Lian, who was wearing a dress with some auspicious patterns outlined in silver thread, the ladies were all slightly surprised. The actual appearance of Chu Lian was way too different from the image of the infamous honored Lady Genie they had in their minds. Chu Lian's young face still carried some baby fat in her cheeks. Her skin looked as soft as rose petals kissed with morning dew, and the rest of her features were equally fair and fine. There was the smallest smidge of pink lipstick accentuating her tender lips, and the corners of her mouth seemed to naturally curve upwards, so she looked like she was smiling even in the most neutral expression. The most startling feature of them all were her almond-shaped eyes. Slightly moist and crystal clear, they looked as if they could see through anything. Some of the older madams held a hand up to their foreheads in shock. They couldn't quite accept this huge gap between their expectations and reality. The honored Lady Genie, who was the talk of the town, was merely a young and tender little girl. After Chu Lian bobbed in greeting to the elders present, she tilted her head in extreme confusion. The corners of her eyes twitched as she had a strange feeling that the noble madams and misses seemed to be looking at her rather weirdly. Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't just any normal royal princess. With Chu Lian by her side, the attendees of today's banquet were naturally jumping for the chance to speak to either her or Chu Lian. Additionally, the food lovers present tried to come over to ask Chu Lian about reserving one of the special little courts in Guilin restaurant that only the rich could afford. They all hoped that they might use this chance to trade favors and get themselves one of those little courts. Regardless of gender, the latest trend amongst the capital's upper class was now to treat their friends to a meal at Guilin restaurant. That was something even more impressive than hosting a banquet at Yuhong restaurant. All the noble madams and ladies gathered around Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia. Even the focus of their chatter switched to these two outstanding young ladies, causing the expression of the originally popular Madame Zhu to turn a little stiff. However, Matriarch He was happily watching. Prince Wei didn't participate in politics, and he was also the emperor's full-blooded brother. Now that Royal Princess Duanjia was close with her third granddaughter-in-law, it also meant that Prince Wei's estate was close to House Jing'an. That was a very good thing indeed. Sanlang's wife might be somewhat lazy, but her actions always seemed to align with Matriarch His wishes. Thus, even though their guests were now surrounding the two young ladies, Matriarch He didn't call a stop to it. Chapter 263, Birthday Gift, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Madame Zhu wanted to draw everyone's attention back, but she didn't dare to make any moves in front of Matriarch He. She could only grit her teeth and bear with it. However, the gaze she cast towards Chu Lian was full of envy and disgust. This state of affairs didn't carry on for too long. When Matriarch He saw that it was about time, she led the group of guests over to Countess Jing'an's courtyard. Once they entered the courtyard, they met Heir Jing'an, He Changqi, and the second son, He Changjue. All of the guests here knew very well what the actual purpose of this gathering was. As soon as they entered the parlor, the focus of the noble madams and ladies shifted towards the two men. Royal Princess Duanjia was walking by Chu Lian's side. She turned her head slightly to look at He Erlang, only to see him standing there with his head lowered like a block of wood or a statue, not even daring to look up. It was only then that a hint of satisfaction showed in Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes. Countess Jing'an had already changed into an auspicious dark red gown and an outer coat lined with red fox fur. There was a turquoise headband resting on her forehead, and she had taken the care to powder up her face a little, concealing most of her usual sickly air. The thickness of her winter clothing also covered up how skinny she was. At a glance, she didn't look much different from a normal, healthy noble madam. The noble guests came up one by one to wish Countess Jing'an a happy birthday and to offer up their gifts. The guests today were all from houses familiar with House Jing'an. Knowing that the sickly Countess Jing'an wouldn't be able to withstand a prolonged banquet, they didn't drag out the ceremony and moved at a quick pace. Finally, it was time for the two daughters-in-law to congratulate their mother-in-law on her birthday. Madame Zhu's gift was indeed 100-year-old ginseng, causing the people gathered to react with amazement. Countess Jing'an held Madame Zhu's hands in hers and patted the back of her hand. "Darlang's wife, you didn't have to go to such big expense. Mother, I would be willing to go vegetarian and pray in our family's Buddhist shrine for 3 months as long as it can help you recover, let alone give you just one ginseng." Countess Jing'an smiled and rebuked her gently for not caring more for her own health instead. The noble madams seated around Matriarch He and Countess Jing'an all praised Madame Zhu for being filial. Madame Zhu cast her gaze downwards as if embarrassed by the praise. In actual fact, she was brimming with glee. She had spent a few hundred taels on that 100-year-old ginseng and had even been feeling a little sorry about the expense. However, now that this ginseng had earned her some good reputation amongst these ladies, she felt that the money had been well spent. Filled with satisfaction, Madame Zhu's gaze couldn't help turning to Chu Lian. A glint of provocation and smugness from her victory shone in her eyes. Now that she had given such a precious gift right before Chu Lian, if Chu Lian's gift looked too shabby in comparison, she would completely lose face. She wanted to see how this smart third sister-in-law of hers was going to deal with this situation. Chu Lian was in the middle of whispering something to Royal Princess Duanjia, so she hadn't noticed her eldest sister-in-law's nasty look at all. Realizing that it was her turn, she turned around and took the box that Wenqing had been carrying for her before offering it up to Countess Jing'an. "Mother, this headdress is my gift to you. I hope you'll like it." "A headdress? Ha! How could a countess lack for any accessories at all?" It looked like her third sister-in-law wasn't as smart as she imagined. Countess Jing'an's expression seemed normal. She received Chu Lian's gift cheerfully and affably. "Sanlang's wife, you shouldn't have gone to all that trouble. Chu Lian was so young that she should have been able to stay in her maiden home for another 2 years, if not for Matriarch his burning desire to have a great-grandson. Later on, after she had married in, Sanlang had treated her so abnormally. He hadn't been home much after getting married and had then taken off for the northern border without any warning. This little daughter-in-law of hers hadn't cried or complained. Instead, she had remained kind and innocent. There wasn't any resentment in her towards House Jing'an for Sanlang's actions, nor had she maintained a distance from the family. Countess Jing'an already felt guilty enough in her heart. Seeing how young Chu Lian was, she felt even more inclined to spoil Chu Lian. It's not the gift that matters, but the thought that counts. Chu Lian wasn't expecting to show off her gift. Just as she was about to turn and sit back down at her seat, Madame Zhu hurriedly shot a meaningful look at a young madam next to her. That young madam stepped forward and smiled as she said, "I wonder what kind of headdress honored Lady Genie has presented as a gift. It can't possibly be something from the palace, could it? If Countess Jing'an doesn't mind, could you show it to us and let us expand our horizons?" As expected, when it came to accessories, all the noble madams and ladies here were interested as well. Since someone had already started the topic, they all started to clamor, wanting to see what Chu Lian's gift was. Countess Jing'an hadn't been intending to open it on the spot. She also thought that her youngest daughter-in-law's gift would be rather average. While she was hesitating, Madame Zhu had already added oil to the fire after a quick turn of wit. "Mother, this is third sister-in-law's way of being filial to you. Why don't you just let everyone have a look?" Countess Jing'an didn't know how to get out of this situation without offending someone. She sent an apologetic look to Chu Lian before allowing her handmaid, Miaozhen, to open the accessory case. Royal Princess Duanjia looked down upon petty people like Madame Zhu the most. She rolled her eyes at Madame Zhu without the slightest bit of respect. When Madame Zhu turned her head, she just happened to catch Royal Princess Duanjia's eye roll. The anger that abruptly rose within her made her face turn all sorts of colors as she almost fainted right then and there in rage. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.